Chapter 1287. However, Feng Ling stood up and gently tossed the documents in her hands onto the table. She coldly said, "I don't want to." With that, she turned to leave. Jean Wan also walked out. As she walked by her side, she said, "If you really don't want to see her, then don't. I can also respect your decision regarding the cooperation. You can talk about the business cooperation as you want. Just don't bring me out. I'll be studying at Mr. Zan's house this week. If I don't have time, I might stay at his place. After all, he has a lot of rooms. It's convenient for me to have a bedroom." Seeing Feng Ling's determination, Jean Wan understood her thoughts and nodded. "All right then." 2 days later, Li Nanheng arrived but found nothing. No matter what the occasion was, Feng Ling did not appear at all, nor did she come out with Jean Wan. He looked for opportunities to wait for several days but did not see her. In the end, before he was about to sign the cooperation contract with MN Group, Li Nanheng stood in Jean Wan's office and expressionlessly tossed a stack of contracts on her desk. He asked coldly, "Where is she?" Jean Wan sat behind the desk and looked at him calmly. She bluntly said, "She doesn't want to see you. She took a few days off from me and didn't come to the company." Li Nanheng coldly glanced at her. "CEOG, you're so blunt now." Jean Wan chuckled lightly, but her smile did not reach her eyes. "We can be considered old friends. I'm just saying what I want to say. Do I have to tactfully tell you that Feng Ling is not here?" "Oh, why is she not here? Isn't the reason because she doesn't want to see you? Why did I beat around the bush? Isn't it a waste of breath?" He narrowed his eyes coldly and stared at her face. "That's good. After all, she's still studying in London. If there's no problem, I won't disturb her progress. Since CEOG is so independent and even wants to interfere with Feng Ling's matters, why don't you keep an eye on her private life and let her work hard and study hard during her studies abroad? Don't get too close to those men who appear out of nowhere." Jean Wan nodded and said, "You're right, Feng Ling, don't worry." Jean Wan had been maintaining a cold expression. When she heard these words, she almost collapsed. With some difficulty, she looked at the man in front of her who was warning her seriously but was clearly jealous of her. She continued to maintain a cold expression. "I don't care about Feng Ling's private life, but based on the relationship between sisters and friends, I feel that as long as it doesn't affect her learning progress, it's not a bad choice to let her interact with others occasionally and forget the people and things in the past as soon as possible." Li Nanheng said solemnly, "Do you think she is you? What's the difference between her and me now? She knows how to endure better than me, but once this kind of person who is used to enduring explodes, no one can bear the consequences. I believe she should have already exploded. Otherwise, you wouldn't be so helpless against her now." Jean Wan was no longer pretending to be cold but really indifferent. A layer of frost appeared between Li Nanheng's cold brows, but he did not explain anything. He only said, "Since she is with you now, you should keep an eye on her. You know what I mean. Don't mess around and harm others and yourself. Her mind can't hold more things. If you dare to randomly send people to her, in the end, she will be filled with self-blame and guilt, or if she can't leave some unnecessary circles, she will become a psychological burden. Jean Wan, when my temper is bad, I won't give Mo Jingshan face." Originally, Jean Wan had always been joking. How could she really mess around? However, Li Nanheng's last sentence still caused Jean Wan's expression to freeze. "Whether you give Mo Jingshan face or not, what does it have to do with me?" Jean Wan was expressionless. "Am I very familiar with him?" Li Nanheng only sneered. He glanced at the contract in front of her, picked up the pen, and signed it. He then threw the pen down and turned to leave without looking back. Xiao Ba saw Li Nanheng's back and softly exclaimed. She then pushed the door open and walked in. "Oh my God, so cool. I've never seen this legendary Mr. Li before. I didn't expect him to be so handsome. He is Feng Ling's, Jean Wan's expression was cold because Li Nanheng had mentioned Mo Jingshan. The moment Xiao Ba entered, she felt that the atmosphere was not right and quickly shut her mouth. Seeing that the business cooperation contract had been signed, she walked forward to pick it up and left. She did not dare to speak anymore. Feng Ling did not want to see him. Seeing that she was still studying, Li Nanheng did not look for her. Even though he knew that she was at Mr. Zan's place and could use the fact that he had some relationship with Mr. Zan to capture her, he still gave her time to study quietly and did not disturb her. However, before Li Nanheng left London, he warned Mr. Zan to tell his brother to stay away from Feng Ling and not to touch women he shouldn't touch. Otherwise, it was hard to say if he would personally visit London again. At that time, it would not be as simple as a warning. In the next few months, although Mr. Ian still maintained a considerable interest in Feng Ling was like a block of wood. She did not even agree to treat him to a meal. When she saw him, she would always take a detour. Later on, she even became smarter. Every time she went to Mr. Zan's house, she would ask someone to drive with her, thus avoiding the opportunity for him to send her home. In short, she did not give him any chance at all. Most importantly, because of Li Nanheng, Mr. Zand maintained some doubts about Feng Ling's past. Previously, he had only thought that she was a little girl who had finally returned to the Feng family after suffering outside for a few years. He did not expect that her relationship with Li Nanheng was not simple. A smart person like Mr. Zand had always known how to act appropriately, so he did not take the initiative to matchmake them. Although Li Nanheng did not see Feng Ling, the deterrent effect of coming to London was enough to achieve his goal. Los Angeles, America. Li Corporation. Li Nanheng leaned against the leather chair behind the desk. He played with the pen on the table with one hand and closed his eyes to listen to Xiao Su's report. On August 20th, Feng Ling and Jean Wan went to Paris to participate in Busling's debut show. They stayed in France for a week and met several French partners. On September 3rd, Feng Ling met the general manager of London's GK Corporation alone and discussed a cooperation worth 400 million yuan. On September 8th, Feng Ling, then, when he mentioned the charity banquet sponsored by the London International Bank, Mr. Ian personally invited Feng Ling to attend as his female companion. Xiao Su looked at the report below and paused for a moment. He raised his eyes to look at Li Nanheng, who was calm and composed, as though he was sure that Feng Ling would not attend. On September 15th, Feng Ling attended the charity banquet as Mr. Ian's female companion. The London business media recognized her as Mr. Ian's girlfriend. Li Nanheng abruptly opened his eyes. Li Ha miscalculated. Now that little Feng Ling has studied in England for a year, he can officially go snatch a wife. Chapter 1288. London, MN Group. Feng Ling had been studying in England for a year, and the progress of her studies had almost been completed. According to grandfather Feng's wishes, he planned to let her return to America soon and return to the Feng family, which was currently in New York, to take over several businesses under the Feng Corporation's name. He wanted her to gradually adapt to being independent. This way, her future path would be more perfect and she would be able to apply what she had learned. However, there were still some unfinished matters that she had not finished, so she was not in a hurry to leave. She was used to helping Jean Wan and returning home after she was done. As soon as she walked out, she saw the blue Bugatti parked there. It had been so long. Even though she had not been in Mr. Ian's car many times, she could recognize it at a glance. It had only been a day since she went to the charity dinner as his female companion. Feng Ling thought that she could always live in peace with this Mr. Ian. She had always been wary of such a shrewd man and had never really wanted to approach him. Perhaps because he knew that she was leaving England recently, this Mr. Ian seemed to have suddenly changed his way of pursuing her. In the past, he only appeared occasionally, but because he could not get a response from her, he had never put down his pride to do anything. Recently, he had appeared more frequently. He either asked her to be his female companion or said that he had a gathering at his villa in the suburbs of London. He invited her to go with him, and there were all kinds of invitations. His proactive attitude was obvious. He had changed from the initial reserved and steady way of pursuing her to a more obvious way of pursuing her. However, from beginning to end, Feng Ling only agreed to the dinner party. The reason was actually because of Mr. Zan's concern, which was why she agreed to go. Jin Wan and Xiao Ba were supposed to go that day, but because Jin Wan had a business partner to meet with, Feng Ling had no choice but to go on behalf of MN Group. Originally, she had rejected Ian's invitation, but a few hours before the dinner party began, she had suddenly agreed. At that time, she was in a hurry to attend. Originally, she wanted to wear a simple set of clothes, but Ian said that she couldn't be too casual on such an occasion, so he specially drove her to an image customization center and asked someone to change her gown, do her hair, put on exquisite makeup, and put on high heels. At that time, Feng Ling was in a hurry, so she had no choice but to listen to the arrangements. In the end, when she came out, even a man like Ian, who had been used to seeing love for more than 30 years, was stunned. She looked like a Cinderella who had turned into a princess. The key thing was that her eyes seemed to despise the cumbersome dresses and hairstyle she was wearing. This kind of gaze made it easy for people to lose their minds. On the day of the banquet, Feng Ling sat in his car, listened to his arrangements, and entered the banquet with him as his female companion. However, she didn't realize that there would be reporters at the scene. Today, when she saw the various rumors released by the business media, Feng Ling did not take it seriously. She wasn't a celebrity in the entertainment industry, so she didn't mind this kind of scandal. After all, after closing the door, she had nothing to do with Mr. Ian, so she didn't need to explain. But why was he here again? Feng Ling pretended not to see it and was about to go to the parking lot in front to find her car. However, the moment she walked to the roadside, the blue Bugatti drove over and stopped in front of her. She paused in her steps and looked at the car window that was slowly rolling down. Ian gave her a look for her to get in the car. Feng Ling looked at him calmly. "What's the matter?" Ian smiled and casually placed one hand on the steering wheel. He looked at her sideways. "We've known each other for so long. We can't be considered strangers. You know my situation pretty well. Even if you don't want to be my girlfriend, you shouldn't be so wary. It's not like you'll lose a piece of meat if you get in my car." "I won't lose any meat, but there's no need," Feng Ling said bluntly. She had always been the kind of person who didn't like to cause trouble for herself. She knew that it was impossible for her to like him, so she never gave them any chance to get close to each other. The dinner party the night before yesterday was just a special case. At that time, she had only gone to the London International Bank on Jin Wan's behalf, but it didn't mean that she had given Ian face. Yes, there's no need." Ian reached out to open the front passenger seat door. "I'll take you to see something. After seeing it, we'll leave. I won't hold you back." Feng Ling did not move. "You're about to return to America. What else can I do?" Seeing that she was stubborn, Ian's eyes seemed to be helpless. "Miss Feng, give me some face. After all, I've always treated you well. No matter what, we're friends. You can't be so heartless and cold to friends." Feng Ling glanced at the time and then at him. "What are you bringing me to see?" "Get in the car. I'll show you. You'll know. Don't say that I've never had any ill intentions towards you. Even if I did, I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to defeat you. Get in the car in peace." Ian smiled. There was a trace of impatience in Feng Ling's eyes. She hated dealing with these feelings that exceeded her expectations, but she did not hate Ian very much. This man was very smart and gentlemanly. He would not do anything to annoy her and would always stop at the right time. She opened the car door and sat in. As she fastened her seatbelt, she asked lightly, "Where to?" "How far?" "How long?" "Very close. Half an hour." She raised her head to look out of the car window and suddenly said these words. Ian understood what she meant by giving him only half an hour. Perhaps because he was in a high position, he had been pestered by those passionate women for a long time, and his feelings for them were very indifferent. However, Feng Ling, who hid all the thorns in her body and coldly forbade anyone from approaching, became his favorite. She gradually became a cinnabar mole in his heart. Gradually, he was unwilling to maintain such a distant relationship. He still wanted to conquer her. However, it was difficult for him to do it. He couldn't do it if it was cold, hot, or close. Perhaps, he could only attack her heart, bit by bit, slowly. Ian drove the car to the London International Bank building. This building was 70 stories tall. It was considered above average among the various high-rise buildings in London. There was a very wide and huge rooftop above it. After getting out of the car, Ian gestured for her to follow him. Feng Ling didn't understand, but she still followed. The two of them walked into the elevator and she saw Ian press the button for the rooftop. She immediately glanced at him in confusion. "Why are we going to the rooftop of your building?" Ian smiled. "I'm taking you to the rooftop to threaten you. I'll stand on it and force you to be my girlfriend. If you refuse, I'll jump down." He wanted to chat with more like-minded people about "the warm wind isn't as deep as your love." Chat about life and find a bosom friend. Chapter 1289. Feng Ling was expressionless. "Mr. Ian's joke isn't funny." Ian chuckled. "Then what if I really jump?" Feng Ling glanced at him coldly. "Then jump. I won't stop you." "TSK, you're really..." Ian really loved and hated her temper. In the end, he could only grit his teeth. Although he wished he could pull her into his arms and kiss her to let him know that he wasn't so good-tempered and patient, due to her temper, he knew that he couldn't be too impatient. Otherwise, he would only push her further away. They entered the elevator that only the higher-ups of the bank building could take, so they were unimpeded all the way. They didn't stop in the middle of the 70th floor and went straight to the top. After the elevator arrived, Ian looked at Feng Ling with a faint smile and reached out to invite her in. Feng Ling didn't understand and walked out. After stepping out of the elevator, she saw that there was a small staircase about 10 floors up to the rooftop. She walked over. The moment he walked up the stairs to the rooftop, he saw that the empty space in the middle of the rooftop, which was nearly 1,000 square meters, was covered with red roses. They were not petals, but fresh red roses. In the middle, there was also a huge heart made of white roses. Feng Ling paused in her tracks. Ian walked behind her. "I know this method looks a little tacky, but according to my observation, your experience and everything about you are very simple. I don't know if this tacky way of expressing myself can enter your eyes, but at least I'm sincere. If I can get even a little bit of your heart, I'm willing to pave the entire street with flowers." Feng Ling, Ian walked up to her and lowered his eyes to look at her silent expression. "I've invited you so many times, but you refuse to have a meal with me. Since you're here today, why don't you have dinner here alone?" Feng Ling turned to look at him. "Mr. Ian, I think I should tell you, don't say anything." He reached out and held her wrist. When Feng Ling subconsciously wanted to pull her hand out, he looked at her firmly. "At least, before you return to America, I have to leave something in your heart. Even if it's just a little trace, at least when I chase you to America, I still have a reason to see you." Feng Ling was led into the large rose field in front of them. She stepped on a small path in the middle until she saw an exquisite table. At this moment, Ian pressed a secret bell on the table. Immediately, someone brought up exquisite and luxurious carved candles and various exquisite dishes from various countries and placed them on the table one by one. After the table was filled, Ian gestured for them to leave. When there were only the two of them left, he walked over and pulled out a chair, gesturing for her to sit down. All the pursuits Feng Ling had experienced were Li Nanheng's pure straight man style of, "I like you, I want you." That man had never even given her a decent flower, let alone a rose-paved road and a candlelight dinner. In her impression, Li Nanheng had only given her a small wooden hut in the jungle, but it was later burned down. As for his other temptations and pursuits, they were all simple liking. At that time, Chen Beiqing only gave her a bouquet of flowers every day, but she rejected them all. She didn't even look at them. She didn't have much experience when it came to relationships, so even though the scene looked very tacky, it was her first time. Seeing that Feng Ling didn't move, Ian turned around and pressed down on her shoulder, pressing her to sit on the chair. Since you're already here, give me some face. If you leave now, all the employees in this building will see me. You have to leave me some face. Feng Ling didn't say anything. She just sat there, looking at the candles on the table, and then at the nearly 1,000 square meters of roses under her feet. Needless to say, these flowers were very expensive, not to mention there were so many of them. Seeing that she seemed to be willing to compromise, Ian didn't resist too much. Although his silence made him look uncomfortable, it was a good start. He smiled and sat opposite her. After cutting the medium-well steak that had just been served, he pushed the steak in front of her and took the untouched plate in front of her to his side. He patiently cut it. Feng Ling watched his movements. Mr. Ian, I really don't know how to respond to your great kindness, but you should know my attitude very well. Even if I don't say it, you know it. I know. Ian patiently cut the steak. But after all, you're still single. I have the right to pursue you. I didn't think that I could win your heart today, but there's a saying in China that sincerity can split open metal and stone. After a long time, I'll find a breakthrough for you one day. Feng Ling did not eat the steak in front of her. She glanced at the wine glass by the side, which had already been poured with red wine. She picked up the wine glass and shook it in her hand. She chuckled. If my life hadn't changed so much from the age of 1, perhaps I would have experienced this many years ago. Flowers, red wine, a life so luxurious that I don't have to worry about food and clothes, beautiful gowns, expensive shoes. Unfortunately, Mr. Ian, you don't know much about my past, she said softly. She said softly, although I am indeed the daughter of the Feng family in the United States, in my eyes, any rose here is enough for me to have a full meal. I am also very touched by such a luxurious and high-profile way, but at the same time, I feel sorry for you. These are not suitable for me. Please don't do it again. Ian paused in cutting the steak and looked up at her. He saw that Feng Ling only took a sip of red wine after speaking and had no intention of eating. Vincent said something about you, but he clearly doesn't know much. Ian put down the knife and fork in his hand, picked up a wet towel, and wiped his hands. Do you mind telling me about your past? Feng Ling curved her lips. There's nothing to say. If you're unwilling to tell me, it means that you don't intend to open your heart to me. Ian looked at her with emotion. What kind of method do I have to use to pry open your heart? How can I see what's in your world? How can a girl like you reject me so completely? Even if you're playing hard to get, you've never done it before. Feng Ling smiled lightly and took another sip of red wine. After all, this was the rooftop. It was autumn and the wind seemed to be blowing. She didn't know where the wind came from, but the hair behind her shoulders was somewhat messy and tangled around her neck. I want to talk about, the warm wind isn't as deep as your love, with more like-minded people. Talk about life, find a bosom friend. Chapter 1290. I heard from Miss G that your alcohol tolerance isn't very good, Ian reminded her softly when he saw that she was only drinking. Feng Ling curved her lips lightly. It's just a glass of red wine. It's fine. I definitely won't drink any more. Feng Ling had been in England for a year and had always been well behaved. She couldn't say that she didn't drink at all, but at least she had never drunk too much. Even in some business meetings, even when she had to drink with others, she had always remembered her alcohol tolerance and never lost her composure. It was said that the more sober one was, the less one could immerse oneself in one's senses. Feng Ling had been knocked by fate to the point that she had no choice but to be too sober. She had even come to England in this state, so she had to keep herself on the edge of rationality at all times. She could not slack off at all. The rooftop was very quiet. Feng Ling did not speak much. Throughout the entire process, Ian would occasionally talk about what he had seen recently. Fong Ling would occasionally be silent and smile politely, but it was clear that she was just being polite. She didn't like him. It was obvious that she didn't like him. In the end, Ian put down the cutlery in his hand. If it doesn't suit your taste, shall I take you somewhere else to eat? No, I'm just not too hungry, Fong Ling said softly. Fong Ling said softly, Mr. Ian, I'm about to leave England. If there's no reason, I won't have the chance to come here again. Let's stop here. I don't want to affect my current peaceful and stable life. Ian knew that no matter how hard or soft he tried, he couldn't shake her. He smiled. All right, then this meal will be a farewell for you. I wish you a smooth journey back to America, and I wish you a bright future. Fong Ling smiled. I don't deserve it. For a beginner in the business world like me, it's already a blessing to be able to negotiate a few deals. In this circle, it's already good enough that I can leave an intact corpse. How would I dare to think about a bright future? Although she said that, she still picked up the wine glass and clinked it with him, drinking the last mouthful of red wine in the glass. Perhaps it was because Mr. Ian really did not mention anything about pursuing her. Instead, from the perspective of a friend, he was purely concerned about the various problems she would have to take over the family business after returning to America. From time to time, he would remind her of some important things that she needed to pay attention to. Fong Ling's mood relaxed a lot. She picked up the cutlery and began to eat. As she ate, she chatted and laughed with him. The atmosphere was much more harmonious. After chatting for a while, he looked at Fong Ling's smiling face. I've known you for so long, but this is the first time I've seen you smile at me. Really? The smile on Fong Ling's face did not disappear. She naturally curved her lips. When Fong Ling turned to look at him, Ian had just lowered his head to say something to her, but in an instant, their breaths were so close that she almost bumped into his lips. The man in front of her had a deep gaze. He looked at her face and at her lips. He pressed down on her head and was about to kiss her. All of a sudden, a loud gust of wind came from above the rooftop. The wind speed was so fast that the tablecloth by the table fluttered. Fong Ling also had good ears and felt that the sound was familiar. It was like the sound of a large helicopter propeller. She abruptly pushed Ian away. In the blink of an eye, she saw a black helicopter fly over. It hovered more than 10 meters above the rooftop for a minute before landing on the rooftop. When he landed, the rose petals that covered the rooftop were swept aside by the wind and scattered everywhere. It was a complete mess. Ian turned back to see the helicopter that had suddenly landed on the rooftop of the building and frowned. When Fong Ling saw the 11 logo on the helicopter, her gaze did not change at all. The cabin door opened at this moment, and Li Nanheng's tall figure walked out. He stepped on the roses on the ground that were about to be crushed by the wind and looked at the man and woman who were almost hugging each other. His cold gaze swept across the candles and red wine on the table, and his eyes instantly turned cold. He wanted to chat with more like-minded people about, the warm wind is not as deep as your love. Talk about life, find a bosom friend. Chapter 1291. Ian only saw the man walking out of the helicopter. Looking at his eyes that could almost kill the enemy, he subconsciously protected Fong Ling with one hand and shielded her behind him. At this moment, about 10 members of 11 base in black uniforms suddenly walked out of the helicopter. After walking out, they quickly lined up neatly beside Li Nanheng. As the roses on the ground were too much of a hindrance, they crushed them with their feet and kicked them aside, destroying more of the roses on the ground. Ian only saw that these people seemed to have a gun neatly attached to their waists. The man who appeared first was already looking at Ian's face. Who are you? Ian's expression was very unhappy. Is the rooftop of the London International Bank building a place for you to park your plane? Li Nanheng sneered, and at the same time, frost condensed in his cold brows. He did not answer him but turned his gaze to Fong Ling, who was behind the man. Do you need me to explain to him? Miss Fong? Fong Ling, who was about to speak, turned into Miss Feng, who gritted her teeth. At this moment, Feng Ling, who was never used to being protected, actually stayed behind him safely and did not even show her head. Earlier, if he was not mistaken, this man seemed to be touching her neck and wanting to kiss her. Fortunately, Li Nanheng had left the base. Even if he could mobilize his men, he could not carry a gun with him without permission. Otherwise, he would have shot this grandson. From his words, he was here for Feng Ling. Ian turned to look at Feng Ling behind him. Feng Ling didn't expect Li Nanheng to suddenly appear here. Although she didn't want to see him, she couldn't drag Mr. Ian into this. She nodded apologetically to Mr. Ian. "I'm sorry, they're here for me." "Who are these people?" Ian felt that their background was not small, especially since this group of people could openly and legally hold guns. They were definitely not small characters. 11 Base in Los Angeles, United States. "Have you heard of it?" Feng Ling said in a low voice, "The only private military base under the United Nations that is legal in the world. The one that has made great achievements in dealing with terrorists for several years." Ian said, "I've heard of it, but I don't have much contact with such convenient personnel. I don't know much about it." "You don't have to understand. I have nothing to do with them now. But Mr. Ian, I suggest you don't interfere in this matter. These people are not to be trifled with. Don't bring trouble to yourself." It was obvious that Ian was not worried about himself, but her. "I'm fine, they won't do anything to me." Feng Ling didn't want to mention that she used to be a member of 11 Base. After all, she was no longer a member of 11 Base. Saying that would only make her unhappy. His expression instantly darkened, and a shadow covered the side of his face. "Do you think I'm here to watch you kiss other men?" Feng Ling was angered by this man's matter-of-fact attitude. "First of all, I'm going back to the United States. I'll book a plane ticket myself. Even if I go back, I'll go back to New York, not Los Angeles. I'm not on the same path as you. Besides, it has nothing to do with you. Aren't you being too nosy? This is the International Building of the Bank of London, not the empty square of your 11 Base. Please have some sense of propriety. Don't think that the entire world is under your Li family's feet." Li Nanheng was speechless. "Don't you think that the entire world is under your Li family's feet?" Seeing that she knew how to talk back, Li Nanheng did not say anything. He only said coldly to Xiao Su, "Has she packed her things?" Chapter 1292. Xiao Su replied cautiously from behind, "I've already asked someone to pack up. All the luggage is here, and the passport and other things have been found." "What things? Whose luggage? Whose passport?" "Mine." Feng Ling's eyelids twitched. "Yours." Li Nanheng glanced at her indifferently and turned to leave. Seeing that he was about to return to the helicopter, Feng Ling gritted her teeth and abruptly stood up to follow him. "Why are you touching my things? Li Nanheng, do you still have any respect for the law? How can you touch my things? Don't you know what respect is?" The man didn't even look back. When he reached the cabin door, he coldly said without looking back, "If I didn't respect you enough, I wouldn't have let you hide from me in England for a whole year. Now that your study in England has ended, there's no need to delay. I'll take you back to the United States. Is there a problem?" With that, he went in. Feng Ling stood on the rooftop and didn't move, just looking at the helicopter. Xiao Su looked at the situation and felt that Boss Li was not easy to deal with. Otherwise, he wouldn't have returned to 11 Base overnight to mobilize a helicopter to kill his way here. As soon as he came, he saw Feng Ling and another man having a candlelight dinner on the rooftop and roses all over the ground, and it seemed that they were really intimate. Boss had really tolerated it. Otherwise, he definitely wouldn't have let that person off so easily. Boss was still giving Feng Ling face. He had already endured enough. He walked over and leaned close to Feng Ling to say softly, "Go back with us first. Anyway, you're going back to the United States soon. We'll explain to Miss G later. If she knows that you were taken away by Boss Lee, she won't be dissatisfied. Don't worry, we've brought all the things you should bring. We're just taking you back to the United States. Feng Ling turned to look at Xiao Su and noticed that he was not wearing a uniform. The members of 11 Base were wearing uniforms, but Li Nanheng and Xiao Su weren't. In her memory, Xiao Su had never worn any other clothes. She only knew that Li Nanheng had gone back to take over the Li Corporation, but she didn't know that Li Nanheng had also left 11 Base. She looked up and down coldly for a while and said with no emotion in her eyes, "I'm no longer a member of 11 Base. You should know that your helicopter is not for an ordinary person like me. If you want to help me bring back other things, you can take them back. Please give me my passport. I'll fly back myself." "Oh, little ancestor, don't make trouble. Boss Lee is not a member of 11 Base now, but he can still mobilize the members and helicopters of the base. Don't be angry. Come back with us, ah." Xiao Su sighed. Feng Ling's eyelids twitched. She abruptly turned to look at him. "What did you say?" Xiao Su paused. "I mean, Boss Lee is not a member of 11 Base now. After you left, he also resigned from the management position in 11 Base. He can't go back like you." Feng Ling looked at Xiao Su for a while and did not speak. "Boss has never given up on you. He knows everything about you in England. He also knows that you have been angry with him, so he didn't come to look for you and let you study here peacefully. In fact, Boss is suffering more than anyone else." Xiao Su sighed. This time, Boss suddenly returned to the base to mobilize the helicopter. He has to come over as soon as possible. Feng is in charge of the base now. The helicopter can be mobilized, but Boss can't legally hold a gun now, so he has to send a few members to follow him to prevent anything from going wrong. For you, Boss has risked his life again and again. He can't carry any weapons on him, but he took the risk to drive the base's plane here. This time, he hasn't slept for almost 2 days, but as soon as he arrived, he saw you." Feng Ling glanced at him coldly, and Feng immediately shut his mouth. Then he looked at her with a gaze that could only be understood but not expressed in words, meaning that she should at least obediently get on the plane now. In order to stop things from getting out of hand, she should quickly follow him back to the United States. Seeing that Feng Ling still did not move, Xiao Su simply reached out to pull her arm. "Feng Ling, Miss Feng, little ancestor Feng, baby Feng, I know you and Boss have been in a cold war for a long time. Both of you have bad tempers, but can you?" Feng Ling wanted to say that it was not a cold war, but a breakup. But before she could speak, Xiao Su had already dragged her to the cabin door. Feng Ling turned around and noticed that the members of 11 Base who came with her were all unfamiliar faces. It was probably because Li Nanheng didn't want her to be too embarrassed, so he didn't mobilize any acquaintances. The only acquaintance who came with her was Xiao Su, who knew everything about her. She was silent for a moment and was brought onto the plane by Xiao Su. This plane was very big. It was even bigger than the helicopter she had taken on missions in the past. The space inside was also very spacious. After more than 10 people entered, it didn't feel crowded at all. The main reason was that those people were very restrained in front of the former boss and the former outstanding sniper of the base. All of them sat upright and did not say a word. Facing this atmosphere, Feng Ling was a little helpless. She then saw that Li Nanheng seemed to have not slept for 2 days. Right now, he was standing in the cabin rubbing his brows with one hand, his entire body filled with irritation and displeasure. She looked at the destroyed roses outside and glanced at Mr. Ian, who was walking up the stairs. Seeing her board the plane, the two of them looked at each other through the cabin door. Feng Ling sighed. Fortunately, she had never been merciful. Otherwise, she would have owed him a debt of love. She gave him an apologetic look. Ian picked up his phone, pointed at it, and then at her, asking if it was convenient for her to answer the phone now. Feng Ling shook her head. Since she was leaving England, the relationship that should be ended should be ended. The relationship that had never been started should not be started. This was good for everyone. The plane gradually rose. Li Nanheng put down his hand and turned back to see that Feng Ling was still looking at the man reluctantly. He frowned and said, "Should I send you down to say goodbye to him?" Feng Ling ignored him, but her gaze had already left the rooftop. She silently looked at the gradually rising position outside. Her gaze was flat, and her voice was emotionless. "Since Mr. Li insists on being the good person who sends me back to America, please send me back to New York." Li Nanheng turned around and walked over. He glanced at her and was about to say something when he suddenly saw a red mark on the back of her neck. He narrowed his eyes. "How did you get hurt?" Feng Ling subconsciously raised her hand to cover her neck and did not answer. "Don't block it. Let me see." Li Nanheng frowned coldly and reached out to pull her hand down. Chapter 1293. Feng Ling turned her body to avoid his hand. Her eyes were indifferent. "It's just a small wound accidentally scratched on the lamp stand. Mr. Li, you don't have to worry about it. You just need to send me back to New York." Li Nanheng paused and his hand hovered in the air. He looked at her for a moment but did not put his hand down. Instead, he suddenly grabbed her shoulder and pressed her down on the sofa closest to the cabin door. When Feng Ling was about to break free, he pressed her legs down and pressed her shoulders to prevent her from moving. At the same time, he turned back and coldly ordered the 10 base members behind him, "Turn around. Without my order, don't turn back." "Yes." The 10 base members, who were already very embarrassed, quickly turned around. "What are you doing?" Feng Ling was alarmed by the man's words and actions. She struggled hard, but was still firmly held down by the man's pair of iron-like hands. Then her collar was quickly flipped open, and the wound, which was not too serious but was still very red, was completely exposed to the man. "Why are you like this?" The man took a look and confirmed that what she said was true, but he still placed his hand on her neck and stroked the slightly red part of her wound. "When we get there, disinfect it first." "There's no need." If it weren't for his sudden appearance, her neck would have been disinfected by Mr. Ian. Feng Ling was too lazy to speak. She pushed him impatiently again. "Take your hand away." Not only did Li Nanheng not move his hand away, but he also took the opportunity to press her against the sofa. His gaze shifted from her neck to her face. The little woman, who was restrained and pressed against the sofa, had grown a lot of hair. It had already grown past her shoulders. Due to her struggling movements, the soft strands of hair wrapped around her neck. The clear contrast between her black and white hair and the skin on her neck formed a stark contrast. In particular, she used to only wear sportswear. Now, she was wearing a professional outfit that resembled a female office lady. Although it wasn't a dress, it was still quite feminine. However, despite her obvious change in appearance, her eyes were still as cold as ever. The more she struggled, the harder the man pressed her down. The more she moved, the more he could not control his reaction. It couldn't be helped. It had been too long since he last saw her, and it had been too long since he last touched her. But right now, if she were to forcefully kiss him, Feng Ling would probably explode in anger. Li Nanheng's eyes flashed with annoyance because she was moving under him, and he ordered, "Change the route to Los Angeles." Feng Ling immediately stopped struggling. "You promised to send me back to New York. Why are you bringing me to Los Angeles? If you dare to move again, not only will I take you back to Los Angeles, but I will also skin you right here." The man lowered his head and whispered hoarsely in a voice that only she could hear, "You know, I, Li Nanheng, can do what I say." Xiao Su and the others in the cabin had already turned their backs, but that didn't mean they couldn't hear what was going on behind them. Feng Ling was so angry that her face turned pale. She glared at him fiercely. When Li Nanheng saw that she was so angry that she subconsciously bit her lips, his eyes darkened. God knew how much restraint he needed to not kiss her. She no longer moved but gripped the leather of the sofa tightly with both hands. Her eyes were filled with anger and vaguely fierce. However, her expression, coupled with her feminine appearance, did not have the deterrence she used to have. Instead, she was like an angry little beast, making him want to hug her, stroke her head, and stroke her fur. Li Nanheng really wanted to do this, but just as he was about to hug her, Feng Ling suddenly said, "I won't move. Don't touch me." The man, who was about to reach down to hug her, paused for a moment and lowered his eyes to look at her. He did not speak. Feng Ling looked at him. "I won't move, I won't struggle, and I won't mess with you. Let go of me. When we reach New York, we'll part on good terms." Li Nanheng tightened his chin and said coldly, "Part on good terms?" Because of the man's tense voice, Feng Ling subconsciously felt that it was dangerous. She didn't move on the sofa and avoided his eyes. Seeing that she completely rejected him and didn't even want to talk to him, Li Nanheng's cold face darkened. However, Feng Ling's appearance of being pressed on the sofa made it impossible for him to continue like this. Otherwise, it was hard to say what he would do to her. After all, he had been abstinent for so long and had been a vegetarian for nearly 2 years. Even a monk might not be able to endure it. He let go of her and turned back to order Xiao Su, who was not far behind him. "Later, get someone to bring her luggage up and head back to Beauty Poo." "All right, the people we sent have already packed up. When we arrive at the agreed place, we'll stop for a while and move everything up." Li Nanheng's expression was still cold. He turned to look at Feng Ling, who was sitting on the sofa. He saw that she had buttoned her collar again and combed her long hair back. She frowned, looking dissatisfied with being on his helicopter. Helplessness flashed across Li Nanheng's deep eyes. He turned to walk toward her. Seeing him approach again, Feng Ling's entire body instantly raised her guard. She raised her head and looked at him warily. He did not approach her again and just looked at her. Feng Ling stared back at him coldly. The silent stalemate between the two of them made Xiao Su not even dare to breathe. At this moment, the helicopter began to land slowly. Because of the wind outside, the landing was a little bumpy and unstable. Feng Ling withdrew her gaze because of the bumpiness and no longer looked at him. She closed her eyes and patiently waited for the landing. After the helicopter landed, she was about to get up when Li Nanheng's voice rang. "Get someone to bring the things up. You don't have to go out and get them yourself." With her skills, once she left the cabin, she would definitely disappear without a trace. Even if he could catch up, it would definitely take some time. There was no need to waste time with her here. Seeing that this last chance to escape had been cut off by him, Feng Ling's hands clenched into fists in her sleeves. When she heard Li Nanheng deliberately say, "In case you accidentally get lost after getting off the plane, I'll have to waste time looking for you," she sneered angrily and turned her head disdainfully, too lazy to explain to him. When someone came over to bring Feng Ling's luggage up, several members of the base in the cabin rushed over to pick it up. In the past, Feng Ling did not have much luggage, but in the year she was in England, she was often dragged by Jin Wan and Xiao Ba to buy things. Especially clothes, which filled the entire wardrobe. As a result, her luggage was now packed into 2 large boxes. It's the end of the month, the old auntie is rolling on the ground, begging for monthly tickets, begging for monthly tickets, begging, monthly, tickets. Chapter 1294. However, Feng Ling was more concerned about her books, especially the various books that Mr. Zand had given her, as well as the many business case analyses that she had yet to finish reading. Seeing that her luggage was sent up, when the cabin door closed again, she suddenly got up and walked over. When she passed by Li Nanheng, she did not stop. She walked over expressionlessly, snatched her suitcase from the members of the base, and carried it to the side. Seeing that she was only going to tidy up her own things, no one dared to stop her. Feng Ling opened the suitcase. Sure enough, a group of straight men stuffed her things into the suitcase, but fortunately, nothing was left behind. All the things she often used and important books were still there. She squatted there and tidied up the things inside one by one. After putting away the materials, she took out the other clothes inside. Looking at the clothes that were stuffed into the suitcase, Feng Ling glanced at Xiao Su in disdain. Xiao Su rubbed his nose awkwardly. I'm sorry. When I sent people over to get your things, I only told them to pack your things as soon as possible. I forgot to tell them to put them away properly. Feng Ling was too lazy to speak. She just folded the clothes one by one. Li Nanheng stood by the side, looking at the dresses in her suitcase, and then at Feng Ling, who was squatting there and carefully tidying up her clothes. No matter how hurtful his decision to expel her from 11 base was, at least he finally pushed her back to the right track of her life. A good girl shouldn't risk her life in the base. All the unfairness and suffering that fate had brought her since she was a child should come to an end. She said that she only had 11 base because everything she had experienced in the past had been deeply rooted in her world. But as long as she uprooted those things, she could be reborn. Right now, Feng Ling was as carefree as she used to be. She no longer relied on the base. She could use her identity as the miss of the Feng family to take all the risks and walk out of this world peacefully. There are so many dresses. When are you going to put them on for me to see? The man saw her pick up another dress and fold it neatly. Feng Ling paused and lowered her eyes to look at the dresses in her suitcase. Most of them were forced by Jin Wan and Xiao Ba to force her to try them on and buy them. Many of them didn't even have the tags removed, and she didn't wear them much. She didn't say anything and continued to pack up her things with her head lowered. After packing everything up, she was sure that those bastards at least knew not to touch her underwear when they went to take her things. There was everything here except for her underwear, which meant that they really didn't dare to touch it. After all, she had received too much training back then. She wouldn't feel dizzy and numb from squatting for too long. However, the plane had just returned to a certain altitude when it suddenly jolted again. She had just stood up and hadn't stabilized her body when she suddenly swayed. Li Nanheng was about to help her, but she suddenly reached out to grab the back of the sofa in front of her, quickly avoided his outstretched hand, and stood firmly. Li Nanheng watched her hold the sofa and still came forward to hold her. Sit down. It's windy today. The plane is not very stable. Feng Ling looked at his superfluous action, turned her eyes and looked at him coldly. Li Nanheng pretended not to see it and pressed her back to the sofa. At the same time, he glanced at the red mark on her neck and asked coldly, "Is there a medical kit in the cabin?" "Yes." Xiao Su nodded. When he heard Boss Li say that Feng Ling's neck was injured, he wanted to say it, but at that time, the atmosphere was not right, so he didn't dare to speak rashly. "Bring it over." "All right." Xiao Su hurriedly went to find the first aid kit and handed it to Li Nanheng. He wanted to say that he would help Feng Ling with the wound, but then he saw that Feng Ling's wound was on her neck and she had to open her collar. Boss Li obviously had no intention of doing it for him, so he didn't say much. He eagerly opened the first aid kit and took out the easy-to-use disinfectant cotton and the wound. "Boss, I have all these things." Li Nanheng took the medical disinfectant cotton and picked it up with tweezers. He turned to look at Feng Ling sitting on the sofa and reached out to pull her collar open. Although it was not too big and only half of her collarbone was exposed, Xiao Su instinctively turned his back and waved his hand, signaling the other base members in the cabin to continue turning their backs. Feng Ling knew that she couldn't avoid it. Her eyes were a little impatient, but no matter how impatient she was, Li Nanheng still pressed the disinfectant cotton on the wound on her neck. She didn't feel much pain before, but now it suddenly hurt. She frowned and said coldly with an expressionless face, "Do you know how to do it? If you don't, I'll do it myself." With that, she raised her hand to snatch the thing from his hand. Li Nanheng avoided her hand without a trace and continued to help her clean the slightly red wound. At the same time, he said lightly, "Don't you know whether I know how to do it or not? Haven't I helped you deal with your wounds many times?" Feng Ling didn't speak but turned her head and ignored him. Even if she ignored him like this, at least she was in front of him. It was much better than being separated from him and not being able to see each other. After Li Nanheng cleaned and disinfected her wound, he picked up the medicine powder and sprinkled it on her wound. This time, it didn't hurt very much because the man sprinkled the medicine powder very gently. Then he was about to help her apply the gauze when Feng Ling raised her hand to block his hand. There's no need to apply it. It's not a deep wound. The gauze was indeed dispensable. It was enough to make sure that it wouldn't be infected after disinfection. Li Nanheng didn't insist. He put the gauze back and turned to wash his hands. Feng Ling moved her neck and adjusted her collar to cover the red wound that had just been treated. Her ears were filled with the sound of the propellers outside the helicopter cabin. No matter how fast they flew, it would still take a long time to fly back to New York. After Li Nanheng washed his hands and came out, he saw that Feng Ling had taken a coat and covered herself with it. She leaned against the sofa and looked like she was about to fall asleep. Now she had learned how to take care of herself. She knew how to accept when she couldn't resist, and she also knew how to use sleep to kill time. At the same time, she could avoid too much direct contact with him. Chapter 1295. Even though he knew that she wanted to avoid him by sleeping, Li Nanheng did not say anything. It was a good thing to rest more. After all, they still had to fly for a long time. Li Nanheng only glanced at her. Seeing that she was no longer moving with her eyes closed, he signaled Xiao Su and the others to sit on the other side. Li Nanheng walked over and sat down on another sofa beside Feng Ling. He turned to look at the woman who had fallen into a deep sleep with her eyes closed. He looked at her coat and reached out to help her lift it. In the beginning, Feng Ling did not want to come into direct contact with him. She only wanted to avoid him by sleeping. But perhaps it was because red wine helped her sleep, especially good red wine. Even if it was just a cup, just a few sips, she still fell asleep after sitting quietly with her eyes closed for a while. The helicopter landed on a private helipad in the suburbs of New York. Several cars were already waiting outside. After the plane landed, the base members in the cabin quickly walked out. Xiao Su also glanced at Li Nanheng and Feng Ling before getting off the plane. Feng Ling was still sleeping, and Boss was still sitting by the side looking at her unhurriedly. He did not seem to be in a hurry to get off the plane. Boss, the air traffic control in New York is too strict. To avoid trouble, we landed here first. Drive her back to the Feng family. Should we send her back now, or, there's no rush? Let's wait for her to wake up, Li Nanheng said mildly. He had already brought her back to America. Of course, there was no rush. Whether it was New York or Los Angeles, they were all within his reach. It was no longer England. Seeing that Boss Li was reluctant to wake Feng Ling up, as expected, the well-tempered steel turned soft in front of Feng Ling. Xiao Su did not disturb him anymore and got off the plane. Feng Ling continued to sleep for a while. The sky outside was already bright. It was past 7 in the morning. Seeing that Feng Ling was still sleeping, Li Nanheng bent over and picked her up. His movements were very gentle, trying not to wake her up. When he carried her off the plane and was about to get into the car, Xiao Su walked over. Boss, let's go to the one in front. Let the brothers from the base drive the other cars away first. I'll go back to 11 base and inform them. Li Nanheng responded indifferently and continued to carry Feng Ling. Feng Ling was indeed asleep. If no one touched her, she would be in a deep sleep. However, no matter how steady Li Nanheng's embrace was, he moved from the sofa to another place. Xiao Su followed Li Nanheng and whispered, Boss, carry her to the back. I'll drive. It's okay, I'll drive. But if I leave her alone like this, I'm afraid I'll wake her up. She's awake. Xiao Su, Feng Ling. Feng Ling opened her eyes and looked at the man who had already seen through everything about her. Seeing that she opened her eyes, Li Nanheng wasn't surprised at all. He smiled and looked at her. You're finally willing to open your eyes? Feng Ling took advantage of the way the man carried her into the car and pushed him. She then sat at the back of the car, unwilling to sit with him. Seeing this atmosphere, Xiao Su felt that he shouldn't be an eyesore here, so he didn't follow in and turned to go to another car. Seeing that Feng Ling sat at the back, Li Nanheng didn't say anything. He opened the door of the front passenger seat and started the engine to drive away. This car was very big. He was in front, and she was in the back. The two of them were quiet and didn't communicate much. It wasn't until they crossed a road and drove to New York that Li Nanheng said, "Before you went to England, you should have known that you still have a grandmother. You've seen her before, but during that time, she was ill for a long time and stayed in the hospital in a daze. Later, when she woke up and found out everything, she couldn't take the blow. For the past 2 years, her health hasn't been good. She's living in a sanatorium in Los Angeles. You're in New York. If you have time in the future, go back to see her." Feng Ling did not speak. She had considered the matter of her grandmother before and asked her grandparents about it on the phone. She planned to bring her grandmother to New York to live after she returned to America. She didn't have much family love since she was young, but there were only a few relatives who treated her well. However, they all doted on her. She knew this. Especially the jade pendant on her. It seemed that her grandmother had worn it for her. She didn't have much to say about this matter and answered lightly. Feng Ling was very silent. This silence was different from the cautious and quiet silence she used to have in the base. She was a silence that completely isolated him. Li Nanheng drove and looked at her through the rearview mirror. "What plans do you have after returning to New York?" Feng Ling ignored him and lowered her head to look at her phone for a while. Xiao Ba sent a message asking her why she had disappeared. She was still considering how to answer that she had flown back to New York from London overnight. Jean Wan had probably already received the news and hadn't asked her anything yet. As for Xiao Ba, she was still hesitating on how to reply. Li Nanheng suddenly stopped the car by the side of the road. Feng Ling's finger was poking at the screen of her phone. Because he suddenly stopped the car, she looked up at him. The man looked at Feng Ling through the rearview mirror. Their eyes met. After looking at each other for a moment, he didn't say anything and continued driving forward. Feng Ling watched the man's back as he drove and was silent for a while. In the end, she didn't say anything. She had already said what she needed to say when he gave her the expulsion document of 11 base. Li Nanheng himself knew the decision he had made back then. The two of them were well aware of it, which was why he had not seen her for so long. The car was very quiet. The man drove and the woman lowered her head to look at her phone. In the rearview mirror, sunlight shone in through the slightly open window. She didn't have any makeup on her face, and her long eyelashes drooped slightly because she lowered her head, like an ink fan. Li Nanheng didn't know how much restraint he had used to not kidnap her back to Los Angeles but send her back to New York. He had chosen this path for her. He had taken the risk that she would be angry and break up with him to help her choose this path home and cut off the connection between her and 11 base. Right now, if he didn't send her back to New York but brought her back to Los Angeles, he really wasn't a human being. However, he was not rational. He didn't want to send her back to New York at all. Feng Ling, who had changed so much, was what he had expected. It was what he wanted to see, but now he was afraid to see. The distance that she had created between them was like a ditch that they might not have been able to cross during the 8 years of their grudges. She was trying very hard to avoid him. Even though she did not show any excessive anger, she was avoiding him at all times. Her avoidance was very obvious. She raised her hand to open the door, only to find that the door was locked. She abruptly turned to look at the man driving the car and saw the coldness and displeasure in his back view. The air around him, and even the air in the car, seemed to tense up. Li Nanheng, stop the car. Feng Ling's heart skipped a beat. She frowned and said coldly. Not only did the car not stop because of her words, but it continued to drive forward at an extremely fast speed. Feng Ling couldn't open the car door, so she stepped forward to stop him from driving the car forward. However, the man held the steering wheel with one hand and held her wrist with the other. Without looking back, he said coldly, "Sit back down." "Stop the car." Fong Ling struggled. The man controlled the steering wheel with one hand and drove the car quickly and effortlessly. His other hand also held her tightly. Fong Ling struggled several times but was unable to pull her hand out. In the end, she cried softly, "If you don't let go, my wrist is going to break." Only then did he loosen his grip and let go of her. Fong Ling quickly pulled her hand back and sat back on the seat. As she rubbed her wrist that was about to be broken by him, she watched the road and scenery quickly pass by. "Where are you taking me?" She was not very familiar with the roads in New York, unlike when she was in Los Angeles, where she had been to many places, big and small, and could guess most of them just by looking at the route. But now, she had no idea where he was taking her. Of course, Li Nanheng did not answer her at all. Fong Ling looked over her shoulder at the dashboard in front of him. The car had already exceeded 260. This speed, thankfully, they had suddenly turned from the highway into a small road. The road was smooth, but there were no cars or people around. The road was smooth. Fong Ling rubbed her wrist for a while and didn't say anything. She just sat there expressionlessly and watched Li Nanheng drive. She watched as the scenery on both sides of the road gradually became as though there was no road. Even if there was a road, it was only a very simple stone road. It was not smooth. Then, she watched as the place gradually went uphill. In the blink of an eye, she saw that Li Nanheng had actually driven the car to Mount Nevada in the suburbs of New York. Mount Nevada was a high mountain more than 100 kilometers away from the edge of New York City. There were cliffs on it, and there were beasts in the forest. This place was usually deserted. The black off-road vehicle ignored the potholes and stones on the mountain road and drove all the way up quickly. Because no one walked here all year round, the mountain road that could barely be seen was overgrown with weeds. If this car hadn't been modified and the driver wasn't Li Nanheng, it would have been difficult to drive smoothly on such a slope and mountain road. When the car drove halfway up the mountain, because the slope was even steeper, it broke down once. Fong Ling took the opportunity to ask him to stop, but the man did not make a sound. He continued to start the engine, circled around the steepest and dangerous mountain road, and went to the other side to continue driving up. Half an hour later, they arrived at the top of Mount Nevada. The black off-road vehicle stopped at the top of the mountain. The sky was already bright. At this time, even the sunrise had been missed. However, the direction where the sun was shining was so dazzling that the solar film on the two car windows almost couldn't block it. Fong Ling rolled down the car window and looked at the rising sun in the distance. She narrowed her eyes and then looked at the scenery of the top of Mount Nevada. She saw the steep mountain road on one side and the steep cliff on the other. Fong Ling had lived in the jungle since she was young, so she was not afraid of this kind of place. She only looked outside before retracting her gaze. She looked at Li Nanheng, who had been silent all this time with a dark expression. After stopping the car, he got out of the car with a cigarette in his hand. Seeing the man light a cigarette after getting out of the car, Fong Ling did not move but glanced at the seat next to the steering wheel. She thought that if Li Nanheng dared to do anything to her here, she would drive the car away and leave him here to feed the beasts. Chapter 1297. The car key was not taken away. It could be seen that Li Nanheng had never been wary of her. Was he really not afraid that she would leave him in such a place? Fong Ling glanced at the man outside the car door and watched as he stood there smoking. She could vaguely feel the anger he was suppressing. From the speed at which he drove earlier, she could tell that he was having a hard time holding it in. He had allowed her to lose her temper and vent her cold war. He had been enduring it, but he was still angry. Otherwise, he wouldn't have suddenly driven here. He didn't want to vent his anger on her, so he would rather get out of the car and smoke silently. Fong Ling looked at the man who was in a rage. She felt that if she got out of the car now, he could twist her head off at any time. She couldn't beat him. This was what she had known for so many years. She simply didn't provoke him and sat quietly in the car. She didn't know how many cigarettes the man had smoked outside. At this time, the car window that she had just closed was knocked on. She turned to see the man standing outside the car door. His eyes were cold and heavy, and he looked down at her. "Get out of the car." This was an order. There was no warmth in his tone. Fong Ling pushed the car door open and got out of the car. Before she could stand firm, Li Nanheng pressed her against the car door in front of her. Her back hit the car door hard. It was not painful, but it was definitely not indifferent. As Li Nanheng pressed her down, he leaned over and looked into her eyes. "Fong Ling, do you really think I love you so much that I have no bottom line?" The man's mouth was filled with the strong smell of tobacco. Although it was not unpleasant, because he had smoked too much, especially for someone like Fong Ling who had never smoked, such a strong smell of tobacco was a bit suffocating. Fong Ling saw that this man was like a restrained lion. It was only because it was her that he tried his best to restrain his sharp and fierce claws and teeth. Fong Ling's eyes were calm. Even though her shoulders were pressed by him and her body was imprisoned between his chest and the car door, she was still calm as though the person in front of her had nothing to do with her. "Li Nanheng, since you insist on bringing me to such a desolate place, it means that you want to find a place where no one will disturb you to talk to me. Since you want to talk to me, can you let go of me first?" Li Nanheng lowered his eyes to look at her. Instead of withdrawing his strength, he took a step forward and pressed her more firmly against the car door. Fong Ling's expression instantly darkened. "Since you insist on using such a method, don't blame me for hurting you. Is there anything more ruthless than when you said that you would personally cut off the relationship between us? Hurling insults? Let me hear how you plan to hurt me." Li Nanheng narrowed his eyes at her. If it weren't for the fact that the atmosphere was not right, he really wanted to bite her lips hard, kiss her until she cried, and bite her until she kept struggling and crying under him. The man's eyes were dark and misty. Fong Ling looked straight into his eyes and said word by word, "From the beginning to the end of our relationship, which step didn't you hold my hand and take me away? From the very beginning, when I was still disguised as a man, you forced me to submit to you. Even if you ignored the taboos between genders, you forced me to be with you. And then? When I repeatedly retreated, you forced your way into my life and tied me to your side. You tied me to your heart and couldn't get out. I can indeed see how well you treat me, and I admit that I really couldn't get out. Li Nanheng, you were the one who tied me into your heart. Later, you cut off all my beliefs and the pillar behind me and pushed me away. What kind of attitude do you think I should have toward you now? It's not my character to cry and argue with you hysterically. Since you flew to England and brought me back, it's useless for me to argue with you. Since you decided to send me back to New York, it means that you've never regretted your decision to let me return to the Fong family. Since you chose this path for me, I have no choice or regret. What right do you have to take me away? What right do you have to question my attitude and your bottom line? If you really want to talk about a bottom line, Li Nanheng, have you considered that I have a bottom line too? What did I do to make your bottom line suddenly rise so much?" Li Nanheng asked coldly. He pressed his hand on her shoulder, not allowing her to break free. He was taller than her by a head and imprisoned her. He said harshly, "I let you go back to the Fong family to live a normal life and let you study in England for a year. Did I look for you? Which time did I not respect you? Which time?" Fong Ling suddenly realized that she could not reason with this man who always said that he was very reasonable. She was not good at debating with others. After a year in the business world, she had indeed trained her tongue, but all her training was not used to quarrel with him after returning to America. The more she did not speak, the more she did not want to reason with him. She did not want to waste her breath with him, and the angrier Li Nanheng became. Looking at the indifferent expression in her eyes that she could not be bothered to argue with him, he recalled the mouthful of blood she had spat out by the flower bed downstairs. Every day, he would see the bloodstain when he passed by that place. Later, he didn't know which busybody in the property management department wiped the blood away, but he would often sit by the flower bed for an entire night. He tried his best not to look for the person he did not want to disturb. Now that he had finally brought her back from England, she did not even have the slightest intention of insisting on talking to him. She only avoided him again and again. Seeing that he was unwilling to let her go, Fong Ling closed her eyes and opened them again. Back then, when you gave me the expulsion document, you should have known that you cut off all my paths of retreat. I can no longer be the Fong Ling of the past. Even the Fong Ling who had been moved by you, who had liked and loved you, was cut off by you. A sharp glint flashed across Li Nanheng's eyes. He didn't give her a chance to continue her ruthless words. He pinched the back of her neck and lifted her up from the car door. He forcefully pressed a kiss on her lips, pried open her lips, and swallowed her breath without hesitation. Fong Ling's body tensed up in an instant. As soon as she raised her hands, he quickly held them and pressed them against the car door. In less than a minute, her lips were sore and numb from his kisses. His breathing became heavier and heavier, and he no longer restrained himself. He lifted her clothes and placed his hot palms on the skin of her waist, causing her to shiver all over. W. 4M. Chapter 1298. Li Yu. Li Nanheng. Fong Ling couldn't break free and could only bite him in the end. However, the man seemed to be really angered by her words. He held her waist firmly and said hoarsely, "Do you mean that I've never respected you? In my life, I've only been careful with you, but you said that I'm the one who drove your emotions and I don't respect you? I don't care if you like me or not, do I have to tie you to my side? I'm the one in charge of everything. You're unwilling, and you don't like it?" Li Nanheng took out his hand, abruptly pulled out his belt, and tied Fong Ling's wrist behind her. As Fong Ling widened her eyes in disbelief, he tugged the belt hard, pulled it to the bottom, and tied her wrist in an instant. The back door hadn't closed yet. The man held her waist with one hand and tugged at her clothes with the other. When Fong Ling trembled in anger and was about to bite him, he pressed her into the car. There was no gentleness in this kiss, nor was there any longing or care that he hadn't kissed her for a long time. Instead, with heat and anger, he nibbled on her lips and swallowed all her cries. The hot breath from the man's nose landed on her face. Fong Ling couldn't break free. Several times, she wanted to scold him, but her lips and tongue were blocked by him. Because she struggled hard but couldn't do anything, her nose was bleeding, and dense beads of sweat were on her nose. His kiss became more and more forceful, as though he was going to suck her into a vortex. After kissing for a full 10 minutes, her clothes were removed. As the sun shone brightly outside, the temperature in the car was boiling. Fong Ling's face was crimson. Her oxygen was about to be exhausted, and her brain was buzzing. Li Nanheng's kiss deepened, as though he was tempting her to go crazy with him. Fong Ling was so angry that she lost her rationality. She didn't know when he would stop. If he continued kissing her, she would really die. Especially the fact that her wrists were tied by the belt, it caused countless resentment to burst out of her chest. She kept biting him, and in an instant, their lips were covered with wounds. Of course, he had the most, and her lips were red and swollen from the kiss. Li Nanheng. Stop. Ugh, the man easily picked her up and let her sit on his lap. She could feel his strong muscles in this position. Even though he hadn't been in the base for many days, even though he wasn't used to training every day, this man's body was still shockingly strong. Don't go too far. Fong Ling panted and said with some difficulty as she suddenly sat up. Li Nanheng held her waist and looked at her coldly. Do you know what real disrespect is? I'm afraid you don't even know what it's like to see something by force. Fong Ling's eyelids twitched. She stared at him. What are you doing? When all the madness, passion, crying, and fighting stopped, the sun had already set. Fong Ling was in a sorry state. Her long hair was wrapped around her sweaty neck, and the marks on her body were heavier than before. One look was enough to make her blush and her heart beat faster. Her legs were so weak that she could not even sit properly. She leaned weakly against the car seat, and there was only a man's coat covering her body. She gripped the coat tightly to cover her body, and her reddened eyes were filled with confusion. Her fingers gripped the coat too hard, and the knuckles between her fingers were pale. There were no cleaning measures in the car. Her clothes were torn and messy inside and outside the car. Li Nanheng's shirt was also messy from her grip. He simply put on his clothes and got out of the car. He knew how frightened and messy the little woman in the car was at this moment. At this moment, the last bit of reason in his mind finally returned. He could not face Feng Ling, who he had held in the palm of his hand for so many years, but in the end, in a rage, he pressed her against the car and bullied her. W. 4M. Chapter 1299. Li Nanheng lit a cigarette outside the car and did not come in again. He couldn't face it. He bullied her in the car for several hours, listening to her cry until her throat was hoarse, listening to her bite his arm, and constantly shouting, "Li Nanheng, stop. Li Nanheng, I hurt. Li Nanheng, I hate you. Stop for me." But he still couldn't stop. When he finally regained his senses, he saw the disheveled woman lying on the ground weakly with a blank look in her eyes. Looking at her bloodshot eyes, it was as if his brain had suddenly been struck by a bolt from the blue. He finally woke up from the shock. What was he doing? Li Nanheng held half a cigarette in his mouth and looked back at the closed car door. Even though he couldn't see anything through the window, he knew that she was still curled up inside and couldn't move. He knew how ruthless he was today. Ever since Feng Ling returned to the Feng family for nearly a year and then went to England for so long, she hadn't done it again for a long time. In the end, she was suddenly bullied by him in the car without any preparation. Not to mention Feng Ling's temper, even Li Nanheng himself deeply doubted whether he could forgive himself. He was just angered by her words. Did he really have to use such a disrespectful method to make her feel the difference? Wasn't this digging a pit for himself to jump into? All the kindness he had shown her in the past had probably become negative now. In the end, the cigarette butt was too short. As if burned by the cigarette butt, Li Nanheng took the cigarette down and looked at the car door behind him. He first went to the front passenger seat to find a pack of wet wipes that had been thrown there at some point. Then he returned to the back door and was about to hand him the wet wipes when he entered the car. However, the moment he entered the car and approached, Feng Ling, who had been leaning against the seat motionlessly, suddenly trembled and shrank back. Seeing the trace of fear in her eyes, Li Nanheng's hand that was holding the wet towel froze. It was true. He bullied her too much. She was actually afraid of him. Li Nanheng simply pulled out the wet wipes and stepped forward to lift her coat to help her clean up. However, the moment he reached out, Feng Ling suddenly raised her red eyes and glared at him. "Get out." Her voice was so hoarse that it was almost inaudible. She tugged the coat back hard and covered her messy body. Li Nanheng did not speak, nor did he snatch the clothes she was using to cover herself. He simply helped her wipe her exposed legs. At the same time, Feng Ling quickly curled up her legs and said hoarsely and angrily, "Get lost." Seeing that he still refused to leave and insisted on wiping her body, Feng Ling gathered all the strength she could muster and abruptly raised her hand to slap him hard on the face. Pa! The slap did not make Li Nanheng's face pale. Instead, he felt more comfortable. Even if they drove up smoothly, it was very difficult to go down the mountain. With Li Nanheng's driving skills, it was easy to stabilize the car and not roll down. However, the car swayed, making Feng Ling, who was not in a good condition, very uncomfortable. She frowned and clutched the blanket on her body with a pale face. She curled up in the back seat and couldn't even make a sound. They finally drove down the mountain and arrived at the intersection of New York City according to the original route. Xiao Su and the others' car was still there. They had been waiting anxiously. When they saw Boss Li's car finally coming, they were relieved. Li Nanheng looked at Feng Ling through the rearview mirror. After going down the mountain, the road was more stable and she was no longer in so much pain. However, she still clutched the blanket tightly and looked up at him through the rearview mirror. Her eyes seemed to be able to burn 2 holes in his back and seemed to be warning him, if he dared to let others see her like this, she would never forgive him in this life. Li Nanheng rolled down the car window and asked Xiao Su and the others to wait at the Feng family's home first. He then drove to find a nearby shopping mall. He had to buy a set of clothes for her first. Chapter 1300. After buying clothes and medicine, Li Nanheng parked the car near the shopping mall and quickly went to buy everything he needed. When he returned, he saw that Feng Ling was still curled up there with her eyes closed as though she had fallen asleep. Li Nanheng stepped forward to help her over. He wanted to help her put medicine on her lower body before helping her change her clothes. After all, there might really be some lacerations down there. However, as soon as he helped her over, Feng Ling's head drooped weakly to his side. Li Nanheng paused and lowered his eyes to look at the person in his arms. The touch of his hand was unbelievably hot. He frowned and raised his hand to touch her forehead, neck, and back. It was very hot. Feng Ling, Li Nanheng quickly wrapped her up tightly with a thin blanket. Don't sleep. You have a fever. Feng Ling frowned slightly but could not open her eyes. However, she was still conscious in her heart. Ever since she returned to the Feng family, her stomach had bled and she had a high fever after 2 days of freezing rain. Although her body had recovered later, it was very easy for her to have a fever. Once there was any inflammation or cold, she would have a fever, and the fever was very severe. Jin Wan had said that this kind of phenomenon often occurred in medicine. It was the sequela of severe physical exhaustion. She would occasionally have this kind of situation. Usually, there was nothing wrong with her, but she was especially prone to a fever. As long as she had a fever, she would be in a daze until the fever subsided. In the year that Feng Ling was in England, she only fell ill once, and it was because the weather in London was wet and cold. That time, she went out early in the morning to do something and wore too little. When she got out of the car, it happened to be raining. She caught a cold and was drenched by the rain. After returning, she had a high fever for a day and a night. At that time, it was said that she was in a daze from the fever. Xiao Ba had been staying at her house to take care of her. When she woke up the next day, Xiao Ba said that she had a fever the night before. It was really scary. She didn't know if her fever was serious or not, but her eyelids were so heavy that she couldn't open them. Even though she knew who was hugging her and knew that she had to leave this bastard's car as soon as possible, she couldn't open her eyes. He didn't even need to think to guess that it was probably because he had injured her lower body. It was already difficult to talk about the injury, and now she had a fever. Li Nanheng saw that Feng Ling frowned slightly and knew that she was unwilling to go to the hospital. Although her body temperature was high, it was not too shocking. He simply wrapped her in a thin blanket with his coat, picked up the medicine and clothes, and carried her out of the car. There was a hotel behind. Without saying a word, Li Nanheng carried her into the hotel, booked a room, and placed her on the bed. After lying on the bed, Feng Ling seemed to be more comfortable than in the car, but she still frowned slightly and curled up in the thin blanket. She didn't know how long she was half asleep and half unconscious. Suddenly, she felt as though her body had entered a warm pool. Feng Ling's consciousness could not recover. She only felt as though she was being supported to sit in the bathtub. The warm water surrounded her and made her feel much more comfortable. Her body was gradually cleaned and refreshed. Li Nanheng let Feng Ling sit in the water. After patiently washing her by the bathtub, he wrapped her in a bath towel and carried her out. To prevent her fever from worsening, he placed her in his arms and took the hairdryer to dry her shoulder-length hair. After confirming that her hair was no longer wet, he placed her back on the bed. Her temperature was still very high. He called the hotel staff to buy antipyretic medicine and fed it to her. After drinking the medicine, she fell asleep again. He had to wait for her to sweat and her fever to subside, so he couldn't put on clothes for the time being and could only let her lie in the blanket. In her dreams, there were all kinds of people. It was what she had seen and heard in England. Fong Ling kept shuttling through the crowd in her dreams. She didn't know if she was looking for something or hiding from something. She just kept walking. When she suddenly bumped into a man's arms, she raised her eyes and saw Li Nanheng's face. Looking at that face, she couldn't remember what had happened. She only saw that the face in front of her eyes became clearer and clearer. It was so clear that her heart trembled. She turned to hide, but this man's face seemed to be everywhere in front of her. She was so angry that she kept running in the crowd, but no matter how far she ran, he was still there. The ghost lingered. In the end, Fong Ling was so angry that she suddenly took out a sniper rifle from her waist and kept shooting at the dozens of identical faces in front of her. Seeing that the faces were pierced by the bullets and exploded, she put down the gun and continued walking. However, as she walked, the faces that she had smashed gathered again and floated in front of her eyes. She was so angry that she raised her gun again and fired again, but the more bullets she fired, the more that bastardly Nanheng's face gathered in front of her. In fact, this face gradually gathered and turned into a human figure. The scene in front of her suddenly turned into that mountain, and then an off-road vehicle suddenly appeared in front of her. The gun in her hand silently melted. She was pushed into the car by the man who had transformed into her, and her clothes were torn apart. Fong Ling was so shocked that her hair stood on end. For a moment, she couldn't tell if it was a dream or reality. Chapter 1301. Sweating meant that the fever had subsided. Li Nanheng slowly put her leg down to avoid hurting her again. He covered her with the quilt again and reached out to touch her forehead. The temperature dropped a little, but it was still slightly higher than usual. Perhaps it was because of the burning pain down there, but now because of the cool mint of the ointment, it felt more comfortable. However, it was still a little uncomfortable. Fong Ling furrowed her brows in her sleep and rubbed her legs uncomfortably. Li Nanheng pressed her down, bent down to whisper against her lips, "Don't move. The medicine I just applied has an anti-inflammatory effect. It'll be fine tomorrow, okay?" As expected, Fong Ling didn't move anymore. She tilted her head and continued to sleep. Li Nanheng went to get a towel to help her wipe the sweat on her body. The afternoon passed and evening came. When it was dark, Fong Ling opened her eyes after a nap and saw the Nordic-style ceiling light in the hotel room. She was stunned for a long time before she seemed to smell food. She turned around and saw a hotel dining car placed by the bed. She moved a little and found that she was not wearing anything under the quilt. However, her body had been wiped clean after sweating, and it was very clean. Fong Ling glanced at the food on the dining car. She didn't need to guess to know what was going on. These were all the food she had ordered at the airport in the base cafeteria. It was Li Nanheng. Fong Ling closed her eyes and was about to sit up. At this moment, the door of the suite on the other side of the room opened, and the man's tall and straight figure came over. The moment she saw Li Nanheng's face, she recalled the scene she had experienced in the car, and her eyes instantly turned cold. "You're awake. Eat something." Li Nanheng didn't ask if she was still uncomfortable or in pain. As long as she didn't want to answer, it was useless to ask anything. It was better to let her eat to preserve her strength. As expected, Fong Ling didn't speak but just looked at him coldly. Li Nanheng came over and picked up a bowl of noodles on the dining car. He picked up some side dishes and put them on the plate. He sat by the bed and helped her up to eat. When he stretched out his hand, Fong Ling's expression shrank and she watched him warily. "Li Nanheng, eat first. I know you're angry, but don't make things difficult for your body. You can't return to the Fong family in your current state. Even if you want to kill me, scold me, or hit me, you have to have the strength to do it." Fong Ling said hoarsely, "Since you know that I want to beat you, scold you, and kill you, you still want to do such a thing?" Li Nanheng fed the noodles to her mouth and said calmly, "My self-control has never been effective in front of you. I used to endure it again and again. Today, I just didn't restrain myself. Don't you know how much of your words are deliberately provoking and angering me? Fong Ling looked at him in disbelief. Li Nanheng, do you mean you're in the right even though you raped me? The man sent the noodles to her mouth and said softly, open your mouth. After speaking, Fong Ling closed her mouth and looked at him with pursed lips. She didn't open her mouth, so he wasn't in a hurry. He just looked at her patiently. Not hungry? And stamina? Can you do it again? Hearing that she could do it again, Fong Ling clenched her fists under the blanket and stared at him coldly for a long time. It wasn't until Li Nanheng broke the noodles that he unhappily picked up some more noodles and brought them to her mouth that she slowly opened her mouth and reluctantly ate the noodles. She chewed very slowly. Although the food in this hotel was not bad, the feeling of being fed by Li Nanheng bite by bite and the pain in her lower body even after being drugged reminded her how much of a beast this man was in the car on the mountain today. Right, apply the medicine. Although she felt swollen and painful, it was not the kind of burning pain. The thing she felt in her sleep, she suddenly turned to look at the ointment by the side and saw that half of it had been used. He had helped her apply the ointment. He applied the medicine there. Fong Ling's face instantly turned red and she looked at him in disbelief. Li Nanheng seemed to know what she was thinking and didn't say anything, lest she would be more embarrassed. He continued to feed her until Fong Ling took a few more bites mechanically and picked up a few other dishes she liked to eat and brought them to her mouth. Perhaps it was because these were all her favorite foods in the past, but she hadn't eaten them much in the past year in England. After eating for a while, she finally had an appetite and Fong Ling no longer resisted. She didn't turn her head away until she was full and refused to eat anymore. Seeing that she was almost full, Li Nanheng let her go and took a tissue to wipe her mouth. If it weren't for the scene that happened on the mountain, Fong Ling would have thought that this man had changed from a domineering demon to a gentle and warm man just by looking at his patient and gentle side. Unfortunately, it was a pity that even if this man knelt down, he wouldn't be able to erase his beastly behavior today. After eating, get out of bed and see if you feel uncomfortable walking. Apply some medicine before going to bed at night. After using up this small tube of medicine, you should feel much better tomorrow morning. Li Nanheng pushed the dining cart aside and looked at Fong Ling. Give me the medicine. I'll apply it myself. Fong Ling frowned. Li Nanheng's cold brows moved. How are you going to do it yourself? Can you find it yourself? Can you see it? Fong Ling, it's not the first time. We were together many times when we were good. It's not like I didn't help you bathe in the jungle. I've seen everything that shouldn't be seen. Li Nanheng picked up the tube of medicine again and looked at it. At the same time, he said, this medicine needs to be applied carefully and evenly. Are you sure you want to do it yourself? Fong Ling expressionlessly snatched the tube of medicine from his hand and lowered her head to look at the dense English words on it. She was sure that he was right. She did need to apply it evenly and apply it to all the wounds inside. If it was her, she would not be able to do it herself. At the thought of how the man didn't take her to the hospital but went to the pharmacy to buy this medicine, she felt embarrassed. She simply threw the medicine back into his hand and didn't say anything. She leaned back on the bed and said, give me your phone. Li Nanheng stood up, took her phone, and handed it to her. Fong Ling took it and did not even look at him. Right now, she really couldn't go back to the Fong family. Her grandparents missed her every day. If she went back in such a sickly state, the two elders would probably be anxious again. She could only go back tomorrow when she was in a better state. She picked up her phone and saw that there were several missed calls. One was from Mr. Zand, 2 were from Jean Wan, and 2 were from Mr. Ian. There were also some unread text messages, mixed with Xiao Ba's text messages. W. 4M. Chapter 1302. Fong Ling leaned against the bed and replied to the messages one by one. Li Nanheng called the hotel staff to come in and pushed the dining cart away. After a while, someone came and the room returned to silence. Fong Ling had been lying on the bed, tightly covered with the blanket. Li Nanheng poured a glass of warm water and sat down by the bed. He placed the glass on the bedside table beside her. Your body temperature is still around 37.5 degrees. It's still a low fever. Drink more water. Feng Ling did not respond, nor did she look up at him. She just remained silent. Li Nanheng sighed inwardly. The problem between him and Feng Ling was not particularly big. Back then, she was indeed very angry, but after all, it was not a matter of principle between the two of them. She was just angry that he did not even ask her before helping her make a decision for the future and removing her from the base. However, it was clear that he had raped her in the car. He had really committed a big crime. Because Feng Ling had been under the blanket and her fever had not completely subsided, she would occasionally sweat. Li Nanheng sat silently by the side and watched her. She ignored him and did not say anything, so he did not speak. Until he caught a glimpse of her sweating again, her long hair poking at her neck and shoulders because she was sitting on the edge of the bed. Although the hair around her neck looked particularly charming to men, it looked more like she should not be too comfortable. In the past, Feng Ling had short hair. When she was in the jungle, her hair was just over her chin. Now that her hair was considered long, Li Nanheng had never seen it on her. She kept looking at her phone. He watched her for a while and saw that she occasionally raised her hand to push the hair on her neck back. After doing this 2 or 3 times, Li Nanheng got up and left. Feng Ling didn't care where he went. After resting here for a night, she would return to the Feng family tomorrow and have nothing to do with him. After about 10 minutes, Li Nanheng returned. Feng Ling did not even look at him until the man walked back to the bed and said, "Sit up." Feng Ling looked up at him. "What are you doing?" However, he still subconsciously sat up from the bed. At this moment, the man walked around the side of the bed, leaned over, and lifted her hair that was always poking at her neck because of her sweat. Then she felt the man's somewhat clumsy movements as he helped her comb her hair. Feng Ling seemed to hear the sound of a rubber band being tossed back and forth in the man's hand. However, after fiddling with it for a long time, he still failed to help her tie her hair up. "Feng Ling, Li Nanheng, what are you doing?" She couldn't help asking coldly. After being tortured by her hair for a few minutes, the man still couldn't tie his hair into a proper ponytail. His cold brows furrowed as if he had encountered an epic problem. He said, "I saw that your hair was poking at your neck, so I wanted to help you comb your hair. How do you use this thing?" Feng Ling, Jinwan had once used Li Nanheng to describe a straight man. Now she finally understood. Li Nanheng, who usually dealt with the internal and external injuries of various members of the base and could even wrap bandages like a doctor, was defeated by a rubber band that only women would use. So he went out just now to help her find something to comb her hair? Feng Ling raised her hand and took the rubber band from his hand. She said expressionlessly, "Let go of my hair. I'll do it myself." Hearing this, Li Nanheng seemed to be liberated and quickly let go. Then he saw Feng Ling skillfully comb the soft hair behind her head. The rubber band that was as difficult as ascending to heaven in his hands was casually done in her hands. After her hair was done, her neck was clean and comfortable. Feng Ling picked up her phone again and turned back to look at the man standing by the bed. He knew that he had done something wrong. Step by step to atone for his sins? What was the use? Feng Ling still ignored him, but when she sat back on the bed, she raised her head and tucked her hair behind her ear. Suddenly, she felt that when her hair was particularly short, she had never had this kind of trouble because of long hair. This was the first time she had combed her hair like this in front of Li Nanheng. She glanced at him again and asked, "Where did you get the rubber band?" "When I went downstairs, I met a 4-year-old girl who happened to be holding a bag of newly bought rubber bands. I bought a mini doll from the shopping cabinet in the hotel lobby for her and asked her to give me a rubber band," Li Nanheng said and sat back on the bed. A rubber band didn't even cost 50 cents. Generally, the things in the shopping cabinets in the hotel lobby were very expensive, and the original mini doll cost at least hundreds of yuan. Feng Ling was speechless about the rubber band on her head that was worth hundreds of yuan. Mr. Li's equivalent exchange is really unusual, Feng Ling said mildly and sarcastically. Feng Ling's tone was indifferent, and she said mockingly, but at least you know to exchange something with that little girl instead of shooting her. It seems that you're not as thorough as a beast. Li Nanheng's expression darkened. From today onwards, this woman had really equated him with a psychopath who would forcibly seize things from others. He was not annoyed. He picked up the tube of ointment. I see that you've been looking at your phone idly. I think you're going to sleep soon. Why don't you apply the ointment again? As soon as she heard that he wanted to apply the ointment, Feng Ling's slightly cold and mocking manner instantly disappeared, and she looked at him with a tense expression. Li Nanheng played with the tube of ointment and looked straight into her eyes with a faint smile. At least I know to take care of you before separating your legs, instead of directly breaking them open. It seems that I'm indeed not as thorough as a beast. Feng Ling's fingers tightened and she looked at him coldly. Li Nanheng, you brought me back from England and tortured me like this. Are you very proud of yourself? The man looked into her eyes. You've been expelled from 11 base, and I've also expelled myself. From the age of 13 to the age of 23, you, Feng Ling, have been rooted here for 10 years. In the end, you said that you can attend a dinner party with another man and casually have a candlelight dinner with roses. You're very proud to see me being provoked, aren't you? As he spoke, Li Nanheng leaned forward on the chair and looked into her eyes at close range. I've loved you for 10 years. Did I agree to break up with you just because you said so? N. Li Ha, Daddy T_T, I'm already working hard to atone for my sins. Yesterday, I really couldn't hold it in. Please forgive me, Daddy. It's the beginning of the month. Please throw the monthly ticket at me. Please, 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 W. 4M. Chapter 1303. I've loved you for 10 years. Did I agree to break up with you just because you said so? N. Li Nanheng was not a person who was obsessed with a certain topic. After speaking, he got up to answer the phone and did not mention it again after returning. On the contrary, when Feng Ling slept at night, the moment she closed her eyes, these words echoed in her ears. In the middle of the night, the room was very quiet. This bed was very big, but Li Nanheng did not want to provoke her anymore, so he simply let her sleep alone. He sat on the sofa by the window and fell asleep at some point. Feng Ling had a dream. She dreamed of the 10 years after she met Li Nanheng in the orphanage. After waking up, she could not fall asleep. She sat up on the bed and looked at the man who had fallen asleep on the sofa. After watching for a while, she lowered her eyes, lifted the blanket, and got out of bed. She walked over and stood in front of the man, watching him sitting there sleeping. After watching for a long time, she picked up the thin blanket on the other side of the sofa and gently covered him. After covering him, she leaned over and watched the man with his eyes closed. Li Nanheng, I once spent so many years in 11 base. I thought I would take root there, but in the end, that path was still broken. I have no way back. Feng Ling looked at his sleeping face and said quietly and lightly, you were the one who helped me choose this path. I can't give up halfway. I want to go back and be the towering tree of the Feng family as you wish. I don't know if I can support the Feng family, but I will work hard. After speaking, Feng Ling turned to pick up her clothes and change. She then picked up her phone and his electronic car key and left the hotel. She went to the car to retrieve her luggage, passport, and other things. Then she placed the electronic car key at the front desk of the hotel and asked them to return it to Li Nanheng. When Feng Ling left the hotel room, it was 2:30 in the morning. She put on her clothes and went out. When the door opened and closed, the man on the sofa slowly opened his eyes. Feng Ling sat in the taxi. The sky outside was still dark. After all, the sky had not brightened yet. Unknowingly, dawn was approaching. She arrived at the entrance of the Feng family's villa in New York. Not many people knew that she had returned. After all, Li Nanheng had suddenly brought her back. The Feng family members were even more clueless. She didn't want to disturb everyone's rest, so she got out of the car alone with her suitcase. When she walked into the Feng family's door, Auntie Mai, who had woken up early to prepare breakfast with the servants, saw her. She immediately thought that she had seen wrongly and called out in disbelief, "Second miss?" At the same time, a person walked down the stairs from the second floor. Qin Shuk had been studying abroad for the past 2 years and had just returned to America. She had yet to recover from the jet lag and had woken up very early. As she went downstairs, she yawned and rubbed her eyes. All of a sudden, she heard Auntie Mai's scream and her hand trembled. She abruptly put down her hand and met Feng Ling's gaze. Looking at Feng Ling, who had long hair and was dressed in women's clothes, Qin Shuk staggered and almost fell down the stairs. Her eyes widened. You. When she heard that Feng Ling was a woman and the second daughter of the Feng family, she didn't believe it. However, there had been too many complicated things happening in the Feng family in the past 2 years, so she couldn't comment too much. She just stayed here for a few days after returning to China. After all, when she was young, she often hung out with Qin Xiu's mother and the 2 elders of the Feng family. Even though her surname was Qin, she was only a cousin, but she had always been very familiar with the Feng family. She was even more familiar with them than her own family. Now that she suddenly saw a living Feng Ling in women's clothes, Qin Shuk was so shocked that she couldn't close her mouth for a long time. She stared blankly at her, looking at her from head to toe, and then from toe to head several times. Feng Ling shifted her gaze away from Qin Shuk and nodded at Auntie Mai. "I rushed back overnight and didn't inform anyone. We'll talk about it after Grandpa and Grandma wake up. You can do whatever you need to do. Don't worry about me. Give me your luggage first. You must be tired after coming back so late. Hurry back to your room to rest or sit for a while. When the 2 elders wake up, let's eat breakfast. Second miss, this is your first breakfast. The preparations we've prepared are too simple. Wait until noon or evening, Auntie Mai returned to her senses and quickly stepped forward to take the suitcase from Feng Ling's hand. The old master and the old madam are old and usually wake up very early. They should be awake soon. Give me your luggage first. We've prepared too simple. Wait for noon or evening, No need, Auntie Mai. I'm not picky. Feng Ling smiled at her. She knew that the people of the Feng family were truly good to her. When she first returned to the Feng family, she was still a little distant. However, as time passed, because she could feel that they were sincere to her, she gradually integrated into this family and got along well with Auntie Mai. Auntie Mai was a little excited. She raised her hand to wipe the tears from the corner of her eyes. Second miss, it's not easy for you. You left home for 20 years at such a young age. As soon as you returned home, you had to shoulder such a heavy burden. Before you could enjoy the warmth of your family, you were sent to England to study. Now that you're finally back, can you finally have a good rest? Young people have limitless prospects. Don't work too hard. Feng Ling nodded. Thank you, Auntie Mai. I'll rest at home for a few days. Don't worry. Okay. I'll go prepare breakfast. Auntie Mai chuckled and quickly turned to go to the kitchen. She turned to see that the Qin family's young lady was still in a daze on the stairs. She could tell that her eyes were only filled with surprise. She smiled and went to do her own things. At this moment, Feng Ling turned to look at Qin Shuk. Qin Shuk widened her eyes for a long time. Seeing that she finally had a chance to interrupt, she quickly raised her hand and stared at him in surprise. You. Feng Ling tilted her head slightly and glanced at her with a faint smile. Miss Qin, long time no see. Seeing that Feng Ling was actually smiling, Qin Shuk instantly raised her hand to cover her chest. Oh my god, you actually know how to smile. Feng Ling. Why couldn't she smile? But you're really a woman. Qin Shuk exclaimed as she walked down quickly. She walked up to Feng Ling and circled around her several times. She sized her up. TSK, 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 you're really a woman. And you know how to smile. You're so beautiful. If you were still the little brother I liked, I would have fainted on the spot if you smiled at me like that. But you're actually a woman. Chapter 1304. Feng Ling curved her lips and looked at her from the corner of her eye. So what if I'm a woman? Can't you faint when a woman smiles at you? Hey, 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 stop. Qin Shuk raised her hand and gestured for her to stop. Little Feng Ling, oh, no, it's not little brother Feng Ling. It's cousin Feng Ling. Yes, cousin. You and Feng Mingzhu are both my cousins. But you shouldn't be much older than me, right? As she spoke, she looked at Feng Ling up and down for a while. Perhaps you're my cousin. You're still young. Be careful. Now that you're a woman, don't speak with such a seductive expression. Do you know that you're my first love? Do you know that my heart is bleeding when you stand in front of me dressed like this and with such long hair? My youth, my budding feelings, actually fell into the hands of a woman disguised as a man. I can't accept it. Although Qin Shuk strongly expressed her unwillingness, she only kept walking back and forth in front of Feng Ling. From time to time, she would clench her fists angrily to express her unhappiness. However, this caused Feng Ling to be unable to hold back the polite smile on her face. After thinking for a moment, she picked up her phone and handed it to her. Seeing her actions, Qin Shuk instantly raised her eyebrows. What are you doing? Didn't you dream of getting my phone number back then? Feng Ling tilted her head. Take it. Remember it yourself. Qin Shuk. Although she looked very unwilling, Qin Shuk turned her head away with an arrogant expression. Who wants your phone number, especially since you're still a woman? Let me tell you, my sexual orientation is very normal. I'm only interested in little brothers. With that, she suddenly reached out and took Feng Ling's phone. She quickly and decisively pressed a number. When her own phone rang, Qin Shuk saved her number in Feng Ling's phone. The name saved in the address book was, The Invincible Beautiful Little Cutie Qin Shuk. Feng Ling. After that, Feng Ling returned to her room. Qin Shuk was still unwilling to give up and kept asking her when she was born. She had been wondering whether Feng Ling was her cousin or her cousin. When the old man and the old lady woke up and saw that Feng Ling had returned, they were extremely excited and rushed to Feng Ling's room to talk to her. Qin Shuk could not interrupt and could only sit by the side and stare at Feng Ling from time to time, occasionally adding a sentence. When it was time for breakfast, Qin Shuk took the opportunity to ask about Feng Ling's real birthday. In the end, when she learned that Feng Ling was half a year older than her, she immediately held her chin with one hand and sighed. Oh, so you still have to call me cousin. Back then, Feng Ling didn't particularly dislike Qin Shuk, this enthusiastic little girl. This kind of straightforward person made people feel relaxed. Now that she had such a powerful cousin, not to mention that she didn't have this sexual interest, even if her brain was flooded and she really liked women, she probably wouldn't be able to handle someone like Feng Ling. Old Madame Feng smiled and turned to Grandfather Feng. Young people nowadays talk about things we don't understand, Grandfather Feng also looked at Feng Ling with a smile. It's good that Shuk is helping you. We can be more at ease. Don't quarrel with each other. If there's anything unpleasant, just tell us. We watched Shuk grow up and know her temper. She doesn't have any complicated thoughts. She's just a little impatient. Feng Ling, please be more tolerant of her. If you can't take it anymore, tell us. Aya, it's good enough that cousin doesn't bully me. You actually said that I have a bad temper? Qin Shuk was unhappy. She turned to look at Feng Ling. With her skills, I can't even beat 10 of her. What else can I do to her? No matter what, I'm the one who's at a disadvantage, okay? Chapter 1305. Feng Ling smiled. I won't hit you. Look, look. Her words are clearly a threat. She's reminding me that she really knows how to hit people. Qin Shuk really couldn't eat anymore. She came from 11 base. Great aunt, I'm the one who you have to stand up for. It's me. It's not her. All right. Matriarch Feng couldn't stop laughing. I think the two of you will get along very well in the future. I don't care anymore. Go deal with the relationship between you two sisters. Let's eat. Qin Shuk picked up the cutlery again and glared at Feng Ling across the table. Feng Ling only smiled and ignored her occasional childish temper. Feng Ling rested for a day at the Feng family's residence and went to the companies under the Feng Corporation's name in New York the next day. As the Feng family's business had failed in recent years, there were many small companies that needed to be integrated. In the past, it was the Feng Corporation, but now it was just a bunch of small companies. Some made money, and some did not. The two elders were old and did not have the energy to manage too much. They could only maintain the profits on the surface, but they could not continue to do more. Feng Ling and Qin Shuk sat in the car and looked at the information about all the companies under the Feng family's name. The driver sent by the Feng family drove quietly in front. Although Qin Shuk usually looked like a carefree child, when it came to doing things, she was very serious. Especially when she sat in the car with Feng Ling to discuss the various plans the Feng family was facing, she had many unique opinions with Feng Ling. Then let's do it this way. When they arrived at the company's headquarters in New York, the car was parked outside. Feng Ling put the information aside in the car. I'm still a beginner in these areas. I'm not like you, who have studied business and finance for many years. Furthermore, you've studied abroad and have practical experience. The two of us will follow the plan step by step. First, we'll transfer the company's management, and then we'll start step by step. All right, didn't you study in London for a long time? What I've learned in the past 5 years can't even compare to what you've learned in the outside world for a year. Let's support each other a little. There's absolutely no problem. Qin Shuk blinked at her. One is quiet, one is active. Even when we go out to discuss clients, we can complement each other. Don't worry, I'll definitely stand on the same side as you and help you take back all the power of the Feng Corporation. Feng Ling smiled. Then how should I thank you? I remember that apart from Li Nanheng, there was a little brother who often appeared with you, right? Qin Shuk whispered into Feng Ling's ear, that little brother is also quite handsome, but compared to you in men's clothes, he's still inferior. But in the end, you're a woman. You're beautiful to the bone and not the skin. It's only natural that you're inferior to him. Thinking about it, that little brother's looks are not bad and his personality is also good. Introduce him to me later. Feng Ling, she tried her best to recall and felt that the person Qin Shuk was talking about was Kay. Feng Ling smiled. All right, you have good taste. I'll find a chance to introduce you. Deal. Let's go. I'll accompany you to the Feng Corporation to kill the enemy. 10 months. From the time Feng Ling returned to America to taking over all the businesses under the Feng family, she spent 3 months to take back the power of the company and reorganize the company into a corporation. She spent another 2 months to change the company from inside to outside, replacing it with a group of people who were capable and obedient. She also asked for the resignation of all the old people who were domineering in the company. She spent a total of 10 months to finally gain a foothold in the Feng Corporation. The companies under the Feng Corporation had also returned to the right track a few months ago. In the company, Feng Ling was looking at a financial data. She recalled some of Jean Wan's habits of checking the financial accounts and imitated her. She didn't expect it to be useful. This way of checking the accounts was very effective. All the loopholes could be seen at a glance. Chin Shuk came in with a tablet and read the media's awards for the Fong Corporation's outstanding performance this year. No one dares to believe that a person who has never come into contact with business can stand firm in the business world with such a terrifying momentum. There are all kinds of rumors about this woman named Fong Ling. It's said that she was once the daughter of the Fong family who was lost outside. Later, what's the point of reading these gossip news every day? Fong Ling continued to look at her financial report without looking up. These media outlets have made up all kinds of stories about you. I'm reading the different versions of you written by these people every day. Chin Shuk walked over with a smile and put down the tablet. By the way, when you were answering the internal call in the office, another call came in. It seems to be from the Dr. Chin you mentioned before. Speaking of this Dr. Chin, I've heard you mention him a few times. His surname is also Chin. Hey, should you introduce him to me one day? It's not easy to meet someone with the same surname in America. Hearing that it was Dr. Chin, Fong Ling raised her head and glanced at her. Dr. Chin, don't even think about it. It's impossible for him to be with you. Tisk, I've been thinking about seducing little brother K. How could I seduce Dr. Chin? I like all kinds of little brothers, but I also have my principles, okay? Chin Shuk rolled her eyes at her and looked at the time. Dr. Chin called about 10 minutes ago. Do you want to call him back? I'll call back later. Fong Ling lowered her head to look at the report again. Chin Shuk had pulled her long hair to do a new style not long ago. It was slightly curled and scattered behind her back. When she went to get her hair done, it was because she wanted to meet a long-term client. Chin Shuk said that she looked like a little girl all day long and looked easy to bully, so she took her to have her hair permed. Fong Ling gradually got used to it. Occasionally, when she looked at herself in the mirror, which was completely different from the short-haired tomboy in the past, she would be absent-minded and wonder if the woman in the mirror was still herself. When Chin Shuk went out to prepare for the executive meeting, Fong Ling put down the report in her hand, picked up her phone, and called Dr. Chin. Hello, Dr. Chin, what's the matter? Hearing the man's words, Fong Ling's hand, which had just put down the report, stiffened. Jean Wan? How did she get shot? Is it serious? Where? Los Angeles? Chapter 1306. Fong Ling had planned to return to England to stay with Mr. Zand for a few days, but Jean Wan's sudden accident disrupted her original plan. If it was just a minor injury, it would be fine, but Dr. Chin had specially flown to America from High City and would transfer to Los Angeles in New York. If it wasn't a big deal, Dr. Chin wouldn't have told her to be mentally prepared. Because Jean Wan had been shot by a gunshot, and it was about 3 inches below her neck. That kind of place was almost fatal. She stood up in fear. She didn't even have time to change her clothes or pack her things and walked out. Hey, where are you going? Chin Shuk was still outside and hadn't walked far. Hearing the sound of the door opening, she turned to see Fong Ling walking out quickly. Fong Ling had never been used to wearing high heels, but on some occasions, she had to wear them to match her clothes. She was wearing high heels today. Usually, as long as she wore high heels, she wouldn't walk very fast, but today, she walked like the wind. A friend is seriously injured. I have to go to Los Angeles now. I'll go with Dr. Chin later. Help me take care of the company for a few days. Fong Ling left in a hurry without looking back. Hearing the seriousness in her tone, Chin Shuk quickly followed. Who? Seriously injured in Los Angeles? Is it Li Nanheng? Fong Ling's voice was heavy. Jean Wan. Chin Shuk paused in her steps. Jean Wan. No wonder Fong Ling was so anxious. This was not the first time Fong Ling had heard of this Mrs. Mo. She was truly one of the few good friends she had in her life. Knowing that Chin Shuk was very reliable, Fong Ling was very relieved about New York. She went to the underground parking lot, changed into flat shoes in the car, and drove all the way to the airport. When she arrived at the airport, Chin Sighting had just gotten off the plane and was preparing to go to Los Angeles. The two of them met and didn't have time to exchange pleasantries. They chose the nearest flight together. In the waiting hall, Fong Ling was still answering a call from the company. Chin Sighting went to buy 2 cups of coffee. Seeing that Fong Ling was busy, he didn't say much. He glanced at the time and saw that there was still half an hour before boarding time. He placed the coffee in his hand on the seat next to her. Fong Ling put down the phone and turned to look at the coffee by the side. She then glanced at Chin Sighting. "Sorry, Dr. Chin. I have something to do at the company. I've only taken over for a few months. I still have a lot to deal with." "It doesn't matter. You must be much busier than before." Chin Sighting smiled understandingly. "Back then, you were still a little Fong Ling who only listened to orders in 11 base. Now that you've grown up, you're CEO Fong." Fong Ling sighed with a smile. "What do you mean by always?" To let a person who knows nothing about these things forcibly cut off everything in the past, swallow it whole, and relearn these things that he has never come into contact with before, to me, it's just a heavy burden that I have no choice but to carry on my shoulders. Chin Sighting held the coffee in his hand and was not in a hurry to drink it. He just looked at her. "So, it was Li Nanheng who cut off the past for you. That's why you've been ignoring him like this?" "Not just that. That bastard had kidnapped her from England 10 months ago and had tortured her in the car for a few hours. It was so painful that she was still scared when she thought about it. I didn't leave anyone hanging." Fong Ling also picked up the coffee, opened the lid on the cup, and gently blew on it. Her movements were quiet and natural, and then she curved her lips, but the smile did not reach her eyes. "But after all, he was the one who helped me choose this path. Returning to the Fong family and returning to New York are all according to the path I have to take now. If I give up halfway because of him, or if he regrets halfway and comes to disturb my current life, then I'm afraid there's something wrong with his IQ." Of course, she knew what Li Nanheng was thinking. She didn't do anything, nor did she make a fuss in front of him. She just followed the path that he had chosen for her and walked on it. As for Li Nanheng, he just swallowed his blood. He couldn't see or touch it. He could suffocate to death every day. What was there to be angry about? This silent punishment was enough. Fong Ling took a sip of coffee and didn't want to talk about Li Nanheng anymore. She only asked, "What do you think about Jean Wan's injury?" "I've called a friend in the hospital where she is now. She is injured in the head and the central nervous system of her spine." When Chin Sighting mentioned Jean Wan, his expression became slightly serious. After all, it was really a matter of life and death. "I'm not optimistic about the current emergency treatment. It's very likely that she won't be able to survive." Hearing this, Fong Ling's brows furrowed imperceptibly, and her grip on the coffee cup tightened. Early in the morning, Chin Sighting, who flew from New York to Los Angeles overnight, rushed to the hospital. The lights in the emergency room were on until the next morning. When Chin Sighting arrived, Jean Wan had not come out of the emergency room. "How long has she been in there?" Chin Sighting walked over and asked. Li Nanheng held a cigarette in his hand, but he didn't smoke it. "He just sat here with Mo Jingshan all night." He glanced at Chin Sighting and said lightly, "It's been more than 12 hours. 12 hours. She hadn't been declared dead yet. Under normal circumstances, it might be possible to save her. Otherwise, she wouldn't have lasted so long." Chin Sighting nodded. "When I saved your life with Dr. Wendell in Los Angeles, Dr. Wendell was very skilled in removing bullets from dangerous parts. At that time, I just cooperated with him in the operating room. Now even without me, I believe he has enough ability to save Jean Wan. After all, it's been so long, and he hasn't given up yet. Let's wait a little longer." Although Li Nanheng's skills were excellent, he had participated in countless missions in 11 base and suffered many injuries. He had experienced life and death more than once or twice. Even he couldn't remember how many times this Dr. Wendell in Los Angeles had helped him remove bullets. Am I the one in a hurry now? Li Nanheng pointed with his chin in the direction of the stone on the bench outside the emergency room. Mo Jingshan was stained with Jin Wan's blood, which had dried up, but he hadn't been pushed out yet. Just overnight, Mo Jingshan's chin had some stubble, and his body was covered with blood. He was so miserable that even Qin Sighting couldn't recognize him. When the doctor finally came out and announced the success of the operation, but Mo Jingshan was still in a very critical period and had to be sent directly to the ICU and couldn't be visited for the time being, everyone outside, although they didn't say much, was obviously relieved. At least the operation was successful. It was much better to survive the critical period than to be declared dead on the spot. In this way, at least Jin Wan could survive a few more days with her own vitality. W. 4M. Chapter 1307. Kay asked Qin Sighting why Feng Ling didn't come to the hospital. Didn't he say that he would bring Feng Ling here when he transferred to New York? Qin Sighting spread his hands. We did fly here together, but after landing, she disappeared. I was in a hurry to get to the hospital and didn't go to find her. Kay Nanheng had been waiting for Feng Ling to appear, but after waiting for a long time, she didn't come to the hospital. In this operation, he was ordered to go back to the base to mobilize people, planes, vehicles, and guns. After all, Nanheng had personally dealt with the things in Cambodia, and now he had to go back to Atuda himself. After Jin Wan was injured, Atuda had been caught and locked up in the base. Now there was no time to waste, and he should go back to the base, but he had received accurate information that Feng Ling would come with Qin Sighting this morning. But she didn't show up. Time passed bit by bit, and Jin Wan had been sent to the ICU ward. It was quiet outside the emergency room. Li Nanheng stared at the door of the hospital. Under the repeated urging of the base, he threw his cell phone into his pocket and left expressionlessly. However, less than 5 minutes after Li Nanheng left the hospital, a slender figure in a black wraparound dress appeared in front of the hospital. Seeing that Li Nanheng's car had gone far away, she entered the hospital. Feng Ling was still wearing the clothes she had worn in the company. She wore a black O-style suit jacket outside the wraparound dress. She didn't deliberately hide from Li Nanheng, but after getting off the plane, she received a call from the company. There was a very serious personnel change that needed her to hold a meeting immediately, so she specially found a quiet lounge and communicated with the personnel department on the phone for a while. After finishing her work, Qin Sighting had left because the hospital was very urgent, but he sent her a text message and wrote down the location of the hospital. When Feng Ling rushed over, she heard 2 doctors talking about Jin Wan outside the hospital. When she learned that Jin Wan's operation was successful but she was still in critical condition, she was a little relieved. At the same time, she saw Li Nanheng inside, so she didn't go in. Instead, she went out to buy some fruit from a fruit shop. After Li Nanheng left, she came in. There were still many old friends from the base here. Not wanting to be recognized, she put on a pair of sunglasses. Kay had just answered the phone and was about to come out of the hospital when he suddenly saw a woman with long wavy curly hair, dressed very feminine, and wearing sunglasses walking in. He didn't pay much attention to her. After all, there were many beautiful women in Los Angeles, and such enchanting and charming women were not uncommon. However, at the moment when he brushed past the woman, his footsteps abruptly slowed down. We can't get close to them, and the brothers here can only guard outside the isolation area. Feng Ling nodded, didn't say more, and turned to walk in. Kay opened his mouth and was about to say something, but when the words came to his mouth, he remembered that Boss Lee had just left. She only appeared after he left. Obviously, she didn't want to see him. It seemed that there was no need for him to say more. After all, Boss rarely returned to the base now. Few people knew what was going on between them, and Feng Ling didn't like others to meddle in her business. She didn't know if Boss Lee had ever seen such a feminine Feng Ling. After so long, Boss Lee must have been tortured by Feng Ling. If he saw Fong Ling dressed like this, it was as if she was a completely different person from before. It was likely that many men would fall in love with her. This Boss Lee was probably going to go crazy. W. 4M. Chapter 1308. Jean Wan didn't wake up in the ICU for 3 days. It was said that Mr. Mo sat outside like this for 3 days and barely slept. Although Mr. Mo had a strong heart, Jean Wan had once said that Mo Jingshan was so calm that he didn't look like a human. But right now, Mr. Mo had completely lost his composure. He was disheveled and dispirited. He was covered in Jean Wan's blood, but he didn't wash it. Stubble almost covered his entire chin. He didn't speak or eat. He just sat there, waiting. Everyone was worried that if Jean Wan really didn't wake up, would Mr. Mo collapse? Everyone was trying to persuade him, but Mo Jingshan, who had always been calm and composed and could easily control everything in his hands, seemed to have lost all his godhood in the past 3 days after Jean Wan took the bullet for him, leaving only a shell that was powerless to fight against life and fate. Finally, Qin Sighting found a way to take Mr. Mo to an empty ward to let him rest. It wasn't easy to let Mr. Mo sleep. However, that night, some of Atuda's men sneaked into the hospital, kidnapped the medical staff on other floors, disguised themselves as medical staff, and took Jean Wan away from the ward. The isolation area inside was too far and too long for the members of 11 Base to approach. When they found out, Jean Wan was already gone. When Fong Ling learned of the news, Qin Sighting had already taken the lead to chase after her, but there was still no news. Fong Ling was in a hotel near the hospital and was still negotiating with the company's executives in New York about the personnel change. When she suddenly heard the news, she turned on the computer and quickly contacted Dr. Qin. Qin Sighting was still driving outside. From the sound of the car, it seemed that he was chasing and racing. In order not to affect their chase, Fong Ling asked about the situation briefly. After understanding everything, she asked if there was anything she could help. Qin Sighting told her to wait for news. After that, Fong Ling waited in the hotel. In the end, she couldn't wait any longer, so she went to the hospital. She looked around the ward and saw several old friends in the base. The old acquaintances in the base were Kei, Han Jin, and Xiao Su. As for the other 3 snipers in Terran City, they had just been sent out on a mission last month and had not returned. When Kei returned to the hospital to arrange for a pincer attack, he saw Fong Ling and quickly pulled her over. "It's great that you're here." Without a word, he abruptly handed a sniper rifle to Fong Ling. Come. Quick, I'll give it to you first." "What are you doing?" Fong Ling hadn't touched a gun for a long time. Suddenly, a long and heavy sniper rifle was thrown into her arms. Her expression froze. "Take it first. I guess we'll still have to rely on you to snipe today." Fong Ling didn't know what plan they had to encircle and annihilate that group of people, and Kei didn't explain it clearly. He only told her to keep the gun by her side and then turned to arrange other brothers. After Kei left with a team of people, Fong Ling looked at the sniper rifle in her arms. Although it had been so long, it didn't seem strange at all. She slowly clenched the handle of the gun and turned to look at the empty hospital corridor. When Qin Sighting came to look for Fong Ling, she had yet to return to the hotel. She had been waiting in the hospital. Seeing the sniper rifle in her hand, Qin Sighting did not say anything and let her get into the car. After that, he drove her to the highest hotel in downtown Los Angeles, chose a room on the top floor, and took her there. In the elevator, Qin Sighting briefly summarized the whole plan today. Kei followed Mr. Mo to encircle those people, but there were too many of them, and Jean Wan couldn't stand any trouble now, so they had to finish the battle quickly. It was not impossible to fight head-on, but it would definitely hurt Jean Wan, so there must be a sniper with excellent sniping ability to shoot from behind. At present, the only sniper that those people knew was Kei. They didn't know that Fong Ling was here, nor did they know the relationship between Fong Ling and 11 Base. Based on the current situation, Feng Ling was the most suitable person to shoot from behind. Feng Ling was silent for a moment and then said, I haven't held a gun for a long time. Maybe I can't hold it well. What if I accidentally hurt you? At this time, I'm afraid you can't refuse. Mr. Mo's future and Jean Wan's life are now in your hands. Qin Sighting looked at her. In Jean Wan's current situation, one more second and she will die at any time. Feng Ling immediately looked up at the slowly rising number in the elevator and said calmly, Okay, I understand. When she reached the top floor, she entered the room that Qin Sighting had arranged for her. When she checked the distance from the opposite building by the window, Feng Ling saw that the group of people had forced Jean Wan to retreat to the balcony. Seeing that those people were surrounded by the Brothers of 11 Base, Feng Ling didn't say anything more and decisively set up a sniper rifle in front of the window. Although she was no longer wearing the uniform of 11 Base, and although she was no longer the short-haired capable sniper Feng Ling, at this moment, her movements were still as skilled as many years ago, and she didn't waste a single second. After making all the preparations, she aimed the gun at the back of the head of the person who restrained Jean Wan. Bang! It was a clean shot. At a distance of 500 meters from the opposite building, it hit the enemy's head. With one shot, the enemy was already bleeding on the spot. Seeing Mo Jingshan rush forward to take Jean Wan into his arms in an instant, Feng Ling withdrew the sniper rifle from the window and was about to carry the gun behind her back out of habit, but then she realized that she was no longer a member of 11 Base and it was not convenient for her to take this thing with her, so she put the gun aside and looked back expressionlessly, only to see Qin Sighting who happened to be looking at her calmly. You haven't touched a gun for a long time, right? Qin Sighting asked. I haven't touched a gun since I left the base, so I'm really out of practice. If it weren't for the fact that the person I'm saving today is Jean Wan, I wouldn't have taken this risk so easily. If I didn't aim accurately, I would have killed more than just her. Since Nanheng asked you to come, of course he trusts your marksmanship. Feng Ling's expression froze and she looked at him coldly. Li Nanheng asked you to find me? Otherwise, why do you think I dare to ask you to come? Since he's not too busy and he's still in Los Angeles, why doesn't he come in person? Speaking of marksmanship, Kay and I were also taught by him. Isn't he the safest sniper? Guessing that she had fallen into Li Nanheng's trap, Feng Ling's expression was somewhat unkind. What do you think? Qin Sighting smiled lightly. There was nothing to say. If she didn't leave now, Li Nanheng would probably come up to her. She quickly put the gun away and walked out expressionlessly. Qing's baby has been sick with a fever for several days. Recently, Qing has been a little anxious and may make some mistakes. Please forgive me. W. 4M. Chapter 1309. Qin Sighting didn't know much about her and Li Nanheng, but these days in the hospital, he heard a lot. Feng Ling, Nanheng forced you to leave the base for your own good. You grew up in an orphanage and finally found your family, so you should go back to live a peaceful life. Besides, your family won't allow you to live such a life of life and death, Qin Sighting said. Qin Sighting said, back then, he didn't marry Feng Mingzhu but chose to marry Li Nanheng cenotaph. This matter almost caused the relationship between the Feng and Li families to collapse. They only maintained peace on the surface. After all, it was the Li family who broke the promise first. The Feng family reluctantly accepted the matter of him marrying Li Nanheng cenotaph. This is equivalent to Li Nanheng owing the Feng family a big favor. In the end, it was the lost child of the Feng family. He couldn't negotiate with the Feng family at that time, especially when his father was on his last breath. He asked him to send him back and ask him to leave the dangerous place of 11 Base. Even if it was just for the good of him, he had to do it. Feng Ling didn't seem to hear his words. She didn't stop and walked out without looking back. However, as soon as she walked out of the door, she saw a tall and straight figure standing outside. The man was just outside the door, his back leaning against the wall, a cigarette in his hand flickering between his fingers. Because she came out, he glanced sideways at her. The man narrowed his dark eyes in the smoke and stared at her cold face. Then he took a deep breath of the cigarette and blew the smoke onto her face. Fong Ling looked coldly at Li Nanheng, who had been waiting outside the door for a long time. Sure enough, it was he who ordered people to arrange this encirclement and suppression operation after the incident, and it was he who asked her to be the sniper. The people who failed to stop her in the hospital used this method to force her to appear and wait for him to catch her here. The two of them looked at each other and Li Nanheng smiled. I haven't touched a gun for so long. Are you satisfied today? Do you want to shoot me again, Un? Even though he leaned back against the wall casually, he was still much taller than her. When he looked down at her, he could clearly see every one of her eyelashes. At this time, because she saw him, she seemed to be frozen bit by bit, without any warmth. Even though she had been separated for 10 months and her appearance had been crowned with the shell of the eldest daughter of the Fong family, she was still the former Fong Ling, quiet and cold. Sure enough, if 10 months ago, Fong Ling, who had just returned from England, could still find a trace of her former self, but now, she, who had struggled in the New York business world for nearly a year, had finally erased all the shadows of the past. Except that she was still her entire temperament had changed. She was no longer the short-haired young man. Instead, apart from the sense of indifference and distance, there was also a hint of a woman's aura, the aura of a woman who mingled in the workplace. 10 months ago, she thought he was asleep, and the night she left. Fong family, Fong, and Fong family. Then, she really did it. His heart skipped a beat and ached a little. Li Nanheng threw away the cigarette butt in his hand and stepped on it to extinguish it. He was about to reach out to hold her wrist, but she avoided him without leaving a trace. At the same time, she retreated a meter away. Li Nanheng lowered his eyes to look at her. He was the one who personally sent her away and gave her enough time to grow up. She refused to let him help her. Even in the past 10 months in New York, when she encountered several business crises, he wanted to use the Li Corporation's name to finance and support her, but every time, he was rejected by her. All the financing documents were returned. She did not sign a single word, nor did she agree to it. Her appearance and temperament had changed, but her stubbornness remained the same. He asked in a low and hoarse voice, "Are you going to keep avoiding me?" As though not hearing him, Fong Ling turned around and gave up on taking the elevator. As the elevator was about to pass by him, she turned and walked toward the safe passage in another direction. Li Nanheng's expression faltered and he walked over. Walking into the safe passage, Fong Ling had already walked down the stairs quickly. She was 1 floor away from him. She stopped at the turn of the stairs and suddenly raised her head to look at Li Nanheng. The two of them looked at each other across the dozens of stairs. Li Nanheng only lowered his eyes to look at her indifferently and did not say anything. After a moment of silence, Fong Ling said, "Li Nanheng, do you remember what the first thing I did when I first arrived at 11 Base?" The man gently placed one hand on the railing of the stairs. "What?" "Spar." Fong Ling stared into his eyes. "I said that if I want to stay in 11 Base, you have to see my ability. You asked me to spar with you." Li Nanheng looked at her without batting an eyelid. "So?" Fong Ling curved her lips slightly, but her smile did not reach her eyes. "Although I've left 11 Base, I've only changed from one battlefield to another. It's been more than 2 years since I returned to the Fong family. I don't dare to say that I'm a business genius. I'm just working hard in the Fong family, but at least, I have a place in the business world. For this, perhaps I should really thank my ruthlessness and decisiveness. Otherwise, I wouldn't have become like this." Hearing the meaning behind her words, Li Nanheng did not respond to her mocking tone. He just stood there and looked at her. "Since I've changed battlefields, I should still maintain the rules and habits. After all, my wolfish nature and temper were all polished in 11 Base. Even if I leave, some habits are still deeply rooted in me." Fong Ling's pink lips moved slightly. For example, when I don't like someone, I also want to spar with him. Li Nanheng raised his brows coldly. Feng Ling still looked at him and raised her beautiful eyes slightly. Li Nanheng, in this new battlefield, do you want to spar with me? Li Nanheng curved his lips and casually placed one arm on the railing of the stairwell. He looked down at the woman who was looking up at him and seemed to have accepted her invitation to play. What do you want to spar with? A month later, at the Washington Financial Conference, whoever gets $1 billion of financing first will win. Feng Ling's eyes were bright. Li Nanheng smiled again and his dark gaze fell into her eyes. What are the chips? What's the price for winning or losing? Chapter 13:10. Feng Ling looked at him. You said that you loved me for 10 years. I broke up with you because I said so. You didn't agree. I've thought about it. No matter what age I am, my experience seems to be inseparable from you. I'm destined to be entangled with you for the rest of my life. She paused for 2 seconds before continuing calmly, I'm no longer a teenage girl. I'm about to be 24 years old, which is the right age for marriage. As for you, I either completely break up with you and let go of the knot in my heart to fall in love with other men who pursue me, or I'll be entangled with you for the rest of my life. There's no need for us to waste time on each other. So. Li Nanheng's brows moved slightly. The Washington Financial Conference will raise 1 billion yuan. Within a week, whoever gets it first will win. Feng Ling raised her chin and looked at him indifferently. If you win, I'll marry you. If I win, don't show up again. Let's end things between us. Li Nanheng smiled. That's it? Hearing his tone, Feng Ling looked at him coldly. Don't be so early. I have additional conditions. Speak. You can't let the arms dealers behind you participate in next month's financial conference, nor are you allowed to take out your private funds to participate in the financing. I know you have money, and the Li Corporation doesn't need financing, but the way we compete now is whoever wins the 1 billion yuan outside will win. This game must be based on equal rules. Feng Ling looked at him coldly. If you dare to cheat, I'll dare to find another man to marry. Li Nanheng clasped his hands on the railing and looked down at her. When he heard that she wanted to find another man to marry, he smiled faintly. I'm afraid that man thinks his life is too long. Feng Ling retracted her gaze and no longer looked at him. She looked straight at the floor sign at the corner of the stairs. I'm going to see Jin Wan. With that, she walked down. Listening to Feng Ling's footsteps in the stairwell below, Li Nanheng withdrew his gaze from the stairwell, picked up his phone, played with it in his hand for a moment, and turned to walk out. As he walked, he dialed a number on his phone. After the other party picked up, he said mildly, check all the investors and S-level financiers at the Washington Financial Conference next month. See who they are. After you find out, bring my words to them. If the phone corporation in New York comes to them to study the financing plan, open the door and let her in. Don't make things difficult for her. After giving a few simple instructions, Li Nanheng hung up the phone and turned back to see Qin Sighting leaning against the door with his arms crossed and looking at him with clear and meaningful eyes. Li Nanheng threw the phone back into his pocket and walked over. The enemy has collapsed. Of course. Qin Sighting smiled and glanced at him. I just went to the safety passage and heard a few words. Li Nanheng remained silent. You clearly know that this is the bottom line that she has set for herself. Either she stays with you, or she breaks up completely. Although it is indeed in line with her personality, you only have a 50% chance of winning after taking into account her additional conditions. If you lose, I'm afraid that she will never turn back. But you, on the other hand, not only did you not make things difficult for her, you even asked the financiers to open the door for her. What, are you trying to personally send her away? Li Nanheng put one hand in his trouser pocket and asked instead of answering, if Shi Niange were to play this kind of game with you, would you choose to let her enjoy the pleasure of revenge in this game and let her vent and be happy, Or would you choose to fight her head-on and let her taste the taste of failure? Enchanting raised his brows. You've seen through her. Li Nanheng sneered. It's not like I've done anything unforgivable. If she's angry, I'll help her vent her anger. If she's unhappy, I'll let her take revenge until she's happy. The first 13 years of her life were all messy and blank. In the last 11 years, I was there. No one in this world knows her better than me. Enchanting snorted. Look at your smug expression. It's as though what she said earlier wasn't a sparring game, but a promise to marry you and become Mrs. Li. Li Nanheng smiled. The moment she spoke, she was all ready. You're very confident. It's not confidence. It's the truth. The cenotaph was just a name. It has nothing to do with the truth. Besides, she's still alive, so the cenotaph is useless. You should know this. Of course. Li Nanheng glanced at him from the corner of his eye, as though his brother had accidentally seen his treasure. Just now, did you see her marksmanship? Enchanting replied casually. How is it? Is it outstanding? Handsome? Is it beautiful? Are you envious? Compared to your Shiniange, isn't Feng Ling more beautiful? Enchanting couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't stand this Li Nanheng who had been ignored for more than 2 years and was so excited just because he had just accepted a sparring game. He turned around and left. Jin Wan had really experienced a catastrophe. Feng Ling stayed in Los Angeles for a few days. After Jin Wan was out of danger and was brought back to High City by Mr. Mo, she left Los Angeles. After returning to New York, she began to prepare for the financial conference a month later. In fact, this was the first time she had attended such a grand financial conference. Fifth Avenue in Washington was the largest financial center in the world, but Feng Ling had never been there before. Instead, she went to the edge of the city to carry out missions, eliminate various terrorists, and participate in many life and death rescues. The plane landed smoothly at Washington Airport. After leaving the airport, she took a bus to the city. Feng Ling sat in the back of the car and closed her eyes to rest. After driving for more than an hour, they arrived at the exit of the airport highway. There was a little traffic jam. She opened her eyes from the back and looked at the other cars that were also stuck here. She looked at the peaceful world through the window. Every day, she had to struggle in the bloodbath of the business world. Instead of her hands and feet, she had to move her heart and brain. This kind of life seemed peaceful and without danger, but it was actually very tiring. At least she didn't have to rush to take a helicopter when she was in a hurry, and she didn't have to rush to save people before she could even tuck her clothes in before she had to rush to rescue people. This kind of stability made Feng Ling feel that the past 10 years were just a dream every time she opened her eyes. She didn't know when she was real and when she was fake. Chapter 13:11. Because the financial conference was about to begin next month, Feng Ling had to move many things to Washington this month. The focus of many business cooperation projects would also be shifted here. The reason why she was so busy in the Feng Corporation was because there were still many problems left behind in the Feng Corporation that had not been resolved. For example, when her father, Feng Yuancheng, was still alive, because he didn't have a son and Feng Mingzhu wasn't anything great, he spent many years to nurture a young man named Feng Mingyi. It was said that this Feng Mingyi's family background was ordinary when he was young and he relied on his own abilities to make a name for himself. Later, he coincidentally met Feng Yuancheng and worked under him. Step by step, he spent nearly 10 years to become the general manager of the company. Later, this Feng Mingyi acknowledged Feng Yuancheng as his godfather. Everyone in the Feng family thought that this person would definitely take over half of the Feng Corporation in the future. However, although Feng Yuancheng recognized this godson and nurtured this talent, he did not completely intend to transfer everything under his name to an outsider. Even if this person was now surnamed Feng, this was only a way out for the Feng family. He would only choose this method if he had no other choice. At that time, he actually hoped that Feng Mingzhu would become someone great, but in the end, he was still disappointed. Feng Mingyi was very good at observing people's expressions. His foundation in the Feng Corporation had been stable for many years. When he gradually realized that Feng Yuanqing only treated him as a spare tire, he was unwilling and gradually had ulterior motives. Feng Yuanqing sensed it and directly sent him to a subsidiary to manage matters. After 3 to 4 years, this subsidiary had already been separated from the company by Feng Mingyi and became a company under his own name. It no longer had anything to do with the Feng Corporation. Furthermore, this subsidiary was growing larger and larger. Right now, the headquarters of this company was in Washington. It was called the T Organization. It was a financial institution related to the financial chain and had dealings with many large financial companies on Fifth Avenue. Feng Yuanqing had seen that Feng Mingyi had a good head for business back then. In the end, he had tacitly agreed to let Feng Mingyi separate himself from the company. He only hoped that he would be able to live in peace in the future. At least he would have a godson that he was not familiar with. However, Feng Yuanqing also knew that Feng Mingyi was unwilling to give up. The Feng family, this piece of fat meat that was about to be in his mouth, was actually taken away in the end. The news of the return of the second daughter of the Feng family was what made Feng Mingyi the most unhappy. The Feng family's last hope had been shattered. Why did this second miss suddenly appear? Originally, he wanted to watch the Feng family gradually decline in the hands of this second miss so that he could clean up the battle. However, he didn't expect that this young woman named Feng Ling actually had some tricks up her sleeve. In addition, she had a very professional Qin Shuk by her side. Even if the Feng family didn't prosper, they could at least maintain their former glory. It was still stable. He had just taken over and it was already so stable. If he let this Feng Ling continue to live peacefully like this, if she really made some achievements in the future, he would really lose this fat piece of meat. After learning that Feng Ling would be attending this financial conference, Feng Mingyi checked her information and the various financial businessmen she might contact after arriving here. He sneered and picked up the phone. His cold voice was transmitted over. Inform all the financial partners related to T Corporation. From now on, no one is allowed to accept the Feng Corporation's orders. If you find any clients related to the Feng Corporation, snatch them from me at all costs. It doesn't matter how much money you spend. In short, don't let her stand in this financial conference. She can't get a single cent. Yes, I'm going to cut off the Feng Corporation's path. You should know what to do. After saying this, Feng Mingyi hung up the phone without hesitation. Qin Shuk had just followed Feng Ling to Washington. When she heard the news about the T Corporation, her expression was extremely ugly. It was obvious that they wanted to kill the Feng family at this financial conference. They wanted to break Feng Ling's arm before her wings had fully grown. Furthermore, they didn't hide anything at all. Their goal was so obvious. Back then, Chairman Feng shouldn't have been too kind to that godson. After Qin Shuk told Feng Ling about this, she sat by the side and complained. Feng Ling didn't say anything. She didn't know much about Feng Mingyi. She only learned about it when she investigated the personnel changes and the various companies after returning to take over the Feng Corporation. However, at that time, she was busy with other more important matters and didn't consider whether this person's existence would affect the company. Now it seemed that her father had really let the tiger return to the mountain. He was in such a hurry to force her to return to the Feng family. On his last breath, he had to think of a way to find someone who could help her decide and choose the path to return to the Feng family for her. In fact, what she was really worried about was that if the Feng family lost its leader and the two old men couldn't defeat Feng Mingyi, the Feng family would really lose everything in the end. Does this person want to kill the Feng Corporation? Feng Ling asked. Qin Shuk hesitated for a moment. He does have such a purpose, but I don't think he has the ability. Although the T Corporation has been in Washington for several years, it is still just an organization. It can't even be considered a formal company. No matter how good his interpersonal relationships here are, the Feng family can still suppress him. As long as we don't lose, he might not be able to defeat us. When Feng Ling learned of this, she appeared very calm. After discussing some plans with Qin Shuk, Feng Ling stood quietly in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down from the tall floor. Her tall figure was reflected in the glass. She held her phone, her gaze calm. The weather in Washington was very good. The sunlight shone on her through the window, but Feng Ling felt a chill run down her spine. Not only did the people from the Tea Corporation say that they wanted to block Feng Ling's path, but they also wanted to block all the partners who were about to cooperate with the Feng Corporation. He was so arrogant because he thought that Feng Ling was just a little girl who had been lost outside for many years. She had just returned and had to take on this heavy responsibility. She didn't have any ability at all. If she couldn't get out of the embarrassing situation, she would at most be a little girl who cried in front of the board of directors. She definitely didn't have any extraordinary ability. In the afternoon, Qin Shuk called again from outside. The current situation is like this. These people who are working together in the finance industry don't seem to have any intention of targeting you. Moreover, they seem to admire you. Although I don't know how you became famous in Washington, they don't seem to have any prejudice against you. However, because of what happened on T-Mobile, they don't seem to be on either side. They're just waiting and watching. It's much better than what we expected. Chapter 13-12. All right, I understand. I'll be prepared. Feng Ling's voice was patient and gentle on the phone. Qin Shuk, who already knew her very well, knew that she needed a moment of peace behind her strong indifference. After hanging up the phone, Feng Ling remained standing in the same spot. The large office was empty, and it seemed that only her own breathing could be heard. Then her two phones kept ringing, announcing the official start of the tug-of-war between Feng Mingyue and her. Feng Ling turned slightly, and her long eyelashes fluttered with her movements. Then she expressionlessly picked up the phone that kept ringing. CEO Feng, the relevant personnel in charge of the financial investment department are all clamoring to see you. The assistant's voice came from the other end of the phone, accompanied by noisy chatter. Feng Ling's eyes were cold. Let them in. In less than 5 minutes, more than a dozen heads of the relevant departments walked into the office. They looked at each other, but they didn't know who to speak first. The financing in Washington is probably difficult. Furthermore, some of the deals have been refunded. The Feng Corporation's stock has begun to fall. Our old partners are also under pressure from TMing. They called us to inform us that the contract will not be renewed after the end of the contract. A supervisor frowned and said, CEO Feng, you've only taken over the company for less than a year, and now you've encountered such a big obstacle on your first time attending the financial conference. Do you have any good plans? You can't let so many of us stay here to drink the northwest wind. Right now, it's only TMing's words. As for those partners, they are indeed the ones that the Feng Corporation doesn't plan to continue working with. We haven't even obtained the important financing that can be used. Are these bits and pieces of pressure enough to make us lose control? Feng Ling said coldly. The supervisors, who originally thought that she was in a mess because of this situation, saw that she didn't seem to panic at all. From the moment they heard the news until now, she had been slowly putting pressure on them. Everyone thought that Feng Ling wouldn't have any ideas, but from the looks of it, although TMing's matter would snowball, this snowball clearly wasn't much of a threat to Feng Ling. It wasn't the first day he had followed her. From her expression, he could tell that she was calm. But now those old customers are hinting at us, hinting that we might, I know. Don't worry about it. Carry out all the work you've arranged in Washington. Don't be affected. I know what I'm doing. You can all go out. Feng Ling did not say much and only threw them this sentence. CEO Feng, we've interacted with that Feng Mingyue before. He's a very cunning person. We can't fight him head on. A supervisor hesitated for a moment before saying, besides, He has a lot of tricks up his sleeve. They might not all be open and aboveboard. Feng Ling did not speak. She only looked at the supervisor with her pure black eyes and did not speak for a long time. A nightclub in Washington. The sky was filled with wine and women as they toasted one another. A certain financial tycoon sat on the sofa in the luxurious private room and smiled as he toasted Feng Mingy. After putting down the wine glass, he wiped his mouth. What's the name of the current person in charge of the Feng Corporation? I remember she's the second miss that the Feng family claims to be, right? Yes. Feng Ming raised his brows, but his tone was indifferent as he said, her name is Feng Ling. When she was young, she probably suffered a lot. When she grew up, she was recognized by the Feng family, but she didn't receive any good education. CEOE, don't take her too seriously. In the business world, this kind of little girl with little experience is not worth mentioning. She's not a threat at all. She can be easily suppressed. CEOE played with his wine glass, his eyes shining. What's there to suppress a little girl in her 20s? I'm more interested in her as a person. Feng Ming raised his brows. Oh. CEOE, have you taken a fancy to her? A few months ago, when I went to New York to work, I happened to meet her once. She probably didn't notice me, but I think she's a cold-faced beauty. CEOE narrowed his eyes. At that time, a few security guards bullied her assistant. I turned around and saw her beat up those security guards. I've never seen that expression on a woman before. Feng Ming snorted and smiled. I've checked her past. She seems to have stayed in a military base for a few years. She does have some skills. I've been in the business circle for so many years, but I've never seen such a woman before. I really want to taste her. CEOE rubbed his chin as he spoke. At the same time, he smiled maliciously and raised his glass to Feng Mingy. However, I don't know who has been putting a lot of pressure on Washington recently. It seems like she has someone backing her. I'm not too sure about the details. In short, it won't be easy to target her. Mingy, if you want me to help you hold down this little bit of money, you should at least give me a taste of it, right? What is the sweetness that CEOE is referring to? Feng Ming had an unfathomable smile on his face. CEOE also smiled. I heard that in this circle, Mingy is famous for never giving gifts. If he wants to give gifts, he will only give beauties. As long as a partner takes a fancy to a woman, he will try his best to send her to the other party's bed. Look at this second miss of the Feng family, that's really making things difficult for me. Feng Ming raised his brows. Who in the circle doesn't know that I was the godson of the Feng family? No matter what, this second miss is my godsister. I can give her to anyone, but I can't give my godsister away. Ha 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 ha, godsister, godsister. She's not related to the Feng family by blood. It's been a few years since I last contacted the Feng family. Now I want to personally pull this godsister down. Why do I care about this? CEOE smiled. I reckon that this kind of cold-faced beauty is still a virgin. After all, no one can get close to her. If you like her, you have to do it as soon as possible. Otherwise, if she stays in the business circle for a few more years, who knows how many hands she'll have. Besides, since she has a relationship with the Feng family, I can coax her no matter what. When the time comes, think of a way to send her over to me. This way and that way, make her more obedient, right? CEOE said as he gave him a few looks. Feng Ming curved his lips and played with the wine glass in his hand. It's not that there's no way. It depends on whether CEOE's sincerity is worth the risk. This time, the biggest financing channel is in my hands. It's at least 1 billion yuan, CEOE said confidently. CEOE said confidently, as long as I don't release this sum of money, her trip to Washington will be in vain. Is my 1 billion yuan sincere enough? Okay, deal. You're tuning into the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.